So, just so, if anyone's not familiar, Volume 1 is a detailed report of the attempts of the Russian government to infiltrate our election and to sway persons within the Trump administration and campaign. That happened. It's pretty awful stuff. If anyone watched the testimony this week, went on to illustrate more further it was bad, and I'm still angry about it. Now, Volume 2, it does not have to do with the Russians directly. It has to do with obstruction. And on that note, this report is submitted to the Attorney General pursuant to some rules, which states that at the conclusion of the special counsel's work, he shall provide the Attorney General a confidential report explaining the prosecution or declination decisions the special counsel reached. Beginning in 2017, the President of the United States took a variety of actions towards the ongoing FBI investigation into Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election and related matters that raised questions about whether he had obstructed justice. The order appointing the special counsel gave this office jurisdiction to investigate matters that arose directly from the FBI's Russia investigation, including whether the President had obstructed justice in connection with the Russian-related investigations. The special counsel's jurisdiction also covered potentially obstructive acts related to the special counsel's investigation itself. This volume of our report summarizes our obstruction of justice investigation of the President. We first describe the considerations that guided our obstruction of justice investigation, and then provide an overview of this volume.
First, a traditional prosecution or declination decision entails a binary determination to initiate or decline a prosecution, but we determined not to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment. The Office of Legal Counsel, OLC, has issued an opinion finding that, quote, the indictment or criminal prosecution of a sitting president would impermissibly undermine the capacity of the executive branch to perform its constitutionally assigned functions in violation of the constitutional separation of powers. Given the role of the special counsel as an attorney in the Department of Justice and the framework of the special counsel regulations, this office accepted OLC's legal conclusion for the purpose of exercising prosecutorial jurisdiction. And apart from OLC's constitutional view, we recognize that a federal criminal accusation against a sitting president would place burdens on the president's capacity to govern and potentially preempt constitutional processes for addressing presidential misconduct.
Second, while the OLC opinion concludes that a sitting president may not be prosecuted, it recognizes that a criminal investigation during the president's term is permissible. Necessary. The OLC opinion also recognizes that a president does not have immunity after he leaves office. And if individuals other than the president committed an obstruction or an offense, they may be prosecuted at this time. Given those considerations, the facts known to us, and the strong public interest in safeguarding the integrity of the criminal justice system, we conducted a thorough factual investigation in order to preserve the evidence when memories were fresh and documentary materials were available.
Third, we consider whether to evaluate the conduct we investigated under the Justice Manual standards governing prosecution and declination decisions. But we determined not to apply an approach that potentially results in a judgment that the president committed crimes. The threshold step under the Justice Manual standards is to assess whether a person's conduct constitutes a federal offense. Fairness concerns counsel against potentially reaching that judgment when no charges can be brought. The ordinary means for an individual to respond to an accusation is through a speedy and public trial. With all the and this is a word I can pronounce too. Procedural protections that surround a criminal case. Sorry about that. An individual who believes he was wrongly accused and use that process to clear his name. In contrast to prosecutor's judgment that crimes were committed, that no charges will be brought, affords no such adversarial opportunity for public name clearing before an impartial adjudicator. The concerns about fairness in such a determination would be heightened in the case of a sitting president, where a federal prosecutor's accusation of a crime, even in an internal report, could carry consequences that extend beyond the realm of criminal justice. OLC noted similar concerns about sealed indictments. Even if an indictment were sealed during the presidential term, OLC reasoned it would be very difficult to preserve the indictment's secrecy. And if an indictment became public, the stigma, the opprobrium, could imperil a president's ability to govern. Although a prosecutor's internal report would not represent a formal public accusation akin to an indictment, the possibility of the report's public disclosure in the absence of a neutral adjudicatory forum, that was close, to review its findings counseled against potentially determining that the person's conduct constitutes a federal offense.
Forgive me, I have my daughter's Pokemon binder.
Fourth, if we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, however, we are unable to reach that judgment. The evidence we obtained about the president's actions and intent presents difficult issues that prevent us from conclusively determining that no criminal conduct occurred. Accordingly, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. This report on our investigation consists of 4 parts. Section 1 provides an overview of obstruction of justice principles and summarizes certain investigatory and evidentiary considerations. Section 2 sets forth the factual results of our obstruction investigation and analyzes the evidence. Section 3 addresses statutory and constitutional defenses. Section 4 states our conclusion.
Executive Summary to Volume 2. Our obstruction of justice inquiry focused on the series of actions by the President that related to the Russian interference investigations, including the President's conduct towards the law enforcement officials overseeing the investigations and the witnesses to relevant events. Factual results of the obstruction investigation. The key issues and events we examined include the following: the campaign's response to reports about Russian support for Trump. During the 2016 presidential campaign, questions arose about the Russian government's apparent support for candidate Trump. After WikiLeaks released politically damaging Democratic Party emails that were reported to have been hacked by Russia, Trump publicly expressed skepticism that Russia was responsible for the hacks, at the same time that he and other campaign officials privately sought information redacted about any further planned releases. Trump also denied having any business in or connections to Russia, even though as late as June 2016, the Trump organization had been pursuing a licensing deal for a skyscraper to be built in Russia called Trump Tower Moscow. After the election, the president expressed concerns to advisors that reports of Russia's election interference might lead the public to question the legitimacy of his election.
Conduct involving FBI Director Comey and Michael Flynn. In mid-January 2017, incoming National Security Advisor Michael Flynn falsely denied to the Vice President, other administration officials, and FBI agents that he had talked to Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak about Russia's response to U.S. sanctions on Russia for its election interferences. On January 27th, the day after the President was told that Flynn had lied to the Vice President and had made similar statements to the FBI, the President invited FBI Director Comey to a private dinner at the White House and told Comey that he needed loyalty. On February 14th, the day after the President requested Flynn's resignation, The president told an outside advisor, "Now that we fired Flynn, the Russia thing is over." The advisor disagreed and said the investigation would continue. Later that afternoon, Later that afternoon, the president cleared the Oval Office to have a one-on-one meeting with Comey. Referring to the FBI's investigation of Flynn, the president said, "I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. He's a good guy. I hope you can let this go." Shortly after requesting Flynn's resignation and speaking privately to Comey, the president sought to have Deputy National Security Advisor Katie McFarland draft an internal letter stating that the president had not directed Flynn to discuss sanctions with Kislyak. McFarland declined because she did not know whether that was true, and a White House counsel's office attorney thought the request would look like a quid pro quo for an ambassadorship she had been offered.
Because it did. The president's reaction to the continuing Russia investigation. In February 2017, Attorney General Jeff Sessions began to assess whether he had to recuse himself from campaign-related investigations because of his role in the Trump campaign. In early March, the president told the White House counsel, Donald McGahn, to stop Sessions from recusing. And after Sessions announced his recusal on March 2nd, the president expressed anger at the decision and told advisors that he should have an attorney general who would protect him. That weekend, the president took Sessions aside at an event and urged him to unrecuse. Later in March, Comey publicly disclosed at a congressional hearing that the FBI was investigating the Russian government's efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election, including any links or coordination between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. In the following days, the president reached out to the Director of National Intelligence and the leaders of the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency, CIA and NSA, to ask them what they would do to publicly dispel the suggestion that the president had any connection to the Russian election interference effort. The president also twice called Comey directly, notwithstanding guidance from McGahn, to avoid direct contacts with the Department of Justice. Comey had previously assured the president that the FBI was not investigating him personally, and the president asked Comey to, quote, lift the cloud of the Russia investigation by saying that publicly.
The president's termination of Comey. On May 3rd, 2017, Comey testified in a congressional hearing, but declined to answer questions about whether the president was personally under investigation. Within days, the president decided to terminate Comey. The president insisted that the termination letter, which was written for public release, state that Comey had informed the president that he was not under investigation. The day of the firing, the White House maintained that Comey's termination resulted from independent recommendations from the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General that Comey should be discharged for mishandling the Hillary Clinton email investigation. But the president had decided to fire Comey before hearing from the Justice Department. The day after firing Comey, the president told Russian officials that he had, quote, faced great pressure because of Russia, which had been taken off by Comey's firing. The next day, the president acknowledged in a television interview that he was going to fire Comey regardless of the Department of Justice's recommendation, and that when he decided to just do it, he was thinking that this thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. In response to a question about whether he was angry with Comey about the Russia investigation, the president said, as far as I'm concerned, I want that thing to be absolutely done properly, adding that firing Comey might even lengthen out the investigation.
And just real quick, an interjection, you were all just handed a bingo card. We have a very lovely printed down version of the Mueller Report to hand out to the first person that gets Mueller Report bingo. So if you get a bingo, you know how bingo works. Yell it and we'll give you a bound copy.
Oh, God.
Yeah, we'll just chuck it at you from this end.
We're all going to the fucking
All right. The plot thickens. The appointment of a special counsel and efforts to remove him. On May 17, 2017, the acting Attorney General for the Russia investigation, that would have been Rosenstein, appointed a special counsel to conduct the investigation and related matters. The president reacted to news that a special counsel had been appointed by telling advisors that it was the end of his presidency, quote, and demanding that Sessions resign. Sessions submitted his resignation, but the president ultimately did not accept it. The president told aides that the special counsel had conflicts of interest, remember those, and suggested that the special counsel therefore could not serve. The president's advisors told him the asserted conflicts were meritless and had already been considered by the Department of Justice. On June 14, 2017, on June 14th, the media reported that the special counsel's office was investigating whether the president had obstructed justice. Press reports called this a major turning point in the investigation. While Comey had told the president he was not under investigation, following Comey's firing, the president now was under investigation. The president reacted to this news with a series of tweets criticizing the Department of Justice and the special counsel's investigation. On June 17, 2017, the president called him again at home and directed him to call the acting attorney general, which was Rosenstein, and say that the special counsel had conflicts of interest and must be removed.
Bingo.
Bingo. That right there is obstruction.
That's a whole cool game plan.
That is bingo. Of course, McGahn did not carry out the direction, however, deciding that he would rather resign than participate in another Saturday night massacre.
Hey guys, keep playing. I've already got a copy printed out.
Oh, that's a weird flex name, but you got it.
Probably like illegal, like throwing a bonus crap. Who knows who's a cop anymore? Efforts to prevent public disclosure of evidence. In the summer of 2017, the president learned media outlets were asking questions about the June 9th, 2016 meetings at Trump Tower between senior campaign officials, including Donald Trump Jr., and a Russian lawyer who was said to be offering information about Hillary Clinton as part of Russia and its government support for Trump. It's in quotes, like my other things. You can have me to do anything too. On several occasions, God damn it. On several occasions, stop laughing. On several occasions, the president directed aides not to publicly disclose the emails setting up the June 9th meeting, suggesting the emails would not leak and that the number of lawyers with access to them should be limited. Before the emails became public, the president edited a press statement for Trump Jr. by deleting a line that acknowledged that the meeting was with an individual who Trump Jr. was told might have information to help boost the campaign, and instead said only that the meeting was about adoptions of Russian children. How is this fucking real? When the president asked questions about when the press asked questions about the president's involvement in Trump Jr.'s statement, the president's personal lawyer repeatedly denied that the president had played any role.
Efforts to curtail the special counsel's investigation. 2 days after directing McGahn to have the special counsel removed, the president made another attempt to affect the course of the Russia investigation. On June 19, 2017, the president met one-on-one in the Oval Office with his former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, a trusted advisor outside the government, and dictated a message for Lewandowski to deliver to Sessions. The message said that Sessions should publicly announce that, notwithstanding his recusal from the Russia investigation, the investigation was, quote, very unfair, quote, to the president. The president had done nothing wrong, and Sessions planned to meet with the special counsel and, quote, let him move forward with investigating election meddling for future elections, quote. Lewandowski said he understood what the president wanted Sessions to do. 1 month later, in another private meeting with Lewandowski on July 19, 2017, the president asked about the status of his message for Sessions to limit the special counsel investigation to future election interviews. Lewandowski told the president that the message would be delivered soon. Hours after that meeting, the president publicly criticized Sessions in an interview with the New York Times and then issued a series of tweets, making it clear that Sessions' job was in jeopardy. Lewandowski did not want to deliver the president's message personally, so he asked senior White House official Rick Dearborn to deliver it to Sessions. Dearborn was uncomfortable with the task and did not follow through.
I wish I could do the guy from Frontline's voice.
Further attempts to have the Attorney General take control of the investigation. In early summer 2017, the President called Sessions at home and again asked him to reverse his refusal from the Russia investigation. Sessions did not reverse his refusal. In October 2017, the President met privately with Sessions in the Oval Office and asked him to, quote, take a look, unquote, at investigating Clinton. In December 2017, shortly after Flynn pleaded guilty pursuant to a cooperation agreement, the President met with Sessions in the Oval Office and suggested, according to notes taken by a senior advisor, that if Sessions unrecused and took back supervision of the Russia investigation, he would be a, quote, hero. The President told Sessions, quote, I'm not going to do anything or direct you to do anything. I just want to be treated fairly, quote, unquote. In response, Sessions volunteered that he had never seen anything, quote, improper, unquote, on the campaign, and told the President there was a, quote, whole new leadership team in place. He did not unrecuse.
Efforts to have McGahn deny that the president had ordered him to have the special counsel removed. In early 2018, the press reported that the president had directed McGahn to have the special counsel removed in June 2017, and that McGahn had threatened to resign rather than carry out the order. The president reacted to the news stories by directing White House officials to tell McGahn to dispute the story and create a record stating that he had not been ordered to have the special counsel removed. McGahn told those officials that the media reports were accurate in stating that the president had directed McGahn to have the special counsel removed. The president then met with McGahn in the Oval Office and again pressured him to deny the reports. In the same meeting, the president also asked McGahn why he had told the special counsel about the president's effort to remove the special counsel and why McGahn took notes of his conversations with the president. McGahn refused to back away from what he remembered happening and perceived the president to be testing his mettle.
Conduct towards Flynn, Manafort, redacted. After Flynn withdrew from a joint defense agreement with the president and began cooperating with the government, the president's personal counsel left a message for Flynn's attorneys, reminding them of the president's warm feelings towards Flynn, which he said, quote, still remains, and asking for a, quote, heads up if Flynn knew, quote, information that implicates the president, end quote. When Flynn's counsel reiterated that Flynn could no longer share information pursuant to a joint defense agreement, because duh, the president's personal counsel said he would make sure that the president knew that Flynn's actions reflected, quote, hostility, end quote, towards the president. During Manafort's prosecution and when the jury in his criminal trial was deliberating, the president praised Manafort in public, said that Manafort was being treated unfairly and declined to rule out a pardon. After Manafort was convicted, the president called Manafort, quote, a brave man, end quote, for refusing to, quote, break, and said that, quote, flipping almost ought to, quote, be outlawed. Redacted.
Conduct involving Michael Cohen. The president's conduct toward Michael Cohen, a former Trump Organization executive, changed from praise for Cohen when he falsely minimized the president's involvement in the Trump Tower Moscow project, to castigation of Cohen when he became a cooperating witness. From September 2015 to June 2016, Cohen had pursued the Trump Tower Moscow project on behalf of the Trump board and had briefed candidate Trump on the project numerous times, including discussing whether Trump should travel to Russia to advance the deal. In 2017, Cohen provided false testimony to Congress about the project, including stating that he had only briefed Trump on the project 3 times, only 3 times, and never discussed travel to Russia with him in an effort to adhere to a party line that Cohen said was developed to minimize the president's connections to Russia. Noting. While preparing for his congressional testimony, Cohen had extensive discussions with the president's personal counsel, who, according to Cohen, said that Cohen should stay on message and not contradict the president. After the FBI searched Cohen's home and office on April 2018, I have prepositions, the president publicly asserted that Cohen would not flip, contacted him directly to tell him to stay strong, and privately passed messages of support to him. Cohen also discussed pardons with the president's personal counsel and believed that if he stayed on message, he would be taken care of. But after Cohen began cooperating with the government in the summer of 2018, the president publicly criticized him, calling him a rat, and suggested that his family members had committed crimes.
Unbelievable! Seriously, that really happened with the guy who's president. So, what are the investigators going to do about it? The law enforcement? What happens when the cops show up with this guy? They go on from there. Overarching factual issues. We did not make a traditional prosecution decision about these facts, but the evidence we obtained supports several general statements about the president's conduct. Several features of the conduct we investigated distinguish it from typical obstruction of justice cases. First, the investigation concerned the president, some of his actions, such as firing the FBI director, and these are facially lawful acts within his Article 2 authority, but it raises some constitutional issues. At the same time, the president's position as the head of the executive branch provided him with unique and powerful means of influencing official obstruction of justice analysis. Second, unlike cases in which a subject engages in obstruction of justice to cover up a crime, the evidence we obtained did not establish that the president was involved in an underlying crime related to Russia election interference. Although the obstruction status do not require proof of such a crime, the absence of that evidence affects the analysis of the president's intent and requires consideration of other possible motives for his conduct. Yeah, like trying to make himself look good. Third, many of the president's acts directed at witnesses, including discouragement of cooperation with the government and suggestions of possible future pardons, took place in public view at witness tampering. That circumstance is unusual, but no principle of law excludes public acts from the reach of the obstruction laws. The likely effect of public acts is to influence the witnesses or alter their testimony, but the harm to the justice system's integrity is the same.
Although the series of events we investigated involved discrete acts, the overall pattern of the president's conduct toward the investigations can shed light on the nature of the president's acts and inferences that can be drawn about his intent. In particular, the actions we investigated can be divided into 2 phases, reflecting a possible shift in the president's motives. The first phase covered the period from the president's first interactions with Comey to the president's firing of Comey. During that time, the president had been repeatedly told he was not personally under investigation. Soon after the firing of Comey and the appointment of special counsel, however, the president became aware that his own conduct was being investigated in an obstruction of justice inquiry. At that point, the president engaged in a second phase of conduct involving public acts on the investigation, non-public efforts to control it, and efforts in both public and private to encourage witnesses not to cooperate with the investigation. Judgments about the natures of the president's motives during each phase would be informed by the totality of the evidence.
Statutory and constitutional defenses. The President's Counsel raised statutory and constitutional defenses to a possible obstruction of justice analysis of the conduct we investigate. We concluded that none of those legal defenses provided a basis for declining to investigate the facts. Statutory defenses. Consistent with precedent and the Department of Justice's general approach to interpreting obstruction statutes, we concluded that several statutes could apply here. See 18 U.S.C. sections 1503, 1505, 1512b3, 1512c2. Section 1512c2 is an omnibus obstruction of justice provision that covers a range of obstructive acts directed at pending or contemplated official proceedings. No principle of statutory construction justifies narrowing the provision to cover only conduct that impairs the integrity or availability of evidence. Sections 1503 and 1505 also offer broad protection against obstructive acts directed at pending grand jury, judicial, administrative, and congressional proceedings. And they are supplemented by a provision in Section 1512b aimed specifically at conduct intended to prevent or hinder the communication to law enforcement of information related to a federal crime.
Constitutional defenses. As for constitutional defenses arising from the President's status as the head of the executive branch, we recognize that the Department of Justice and the courts have not definitively resolved those issues. We therefore examine those issues through the framework established by Supreme Court precedent governing separation of powers issues. The Department of Justice and the President's personal counsel have recognized that the President is subject to statutes that prohibit obstruction of justice by bribing a witness or subjoining perjury, because that conduct does not implicate his constitutional authority. With respect to whether the President can be found to have obstructed justice by exercising his powers under Article 2 of the Constitution, which he's been talking about a lot lately, we concluded that Congress has authority to prohibit a President's corrupt use of his authority in order to protect the integrity of the administration of justice.
Under applicable Supreme Court precedent, the Constitution does not categorically and permanently immunize a president for obstructing justice through the use of his Article 2 powers. The separation of powers doctrine authorizes Congress to protect official proceedings, including those of courts and grand juries, from corrupt, obstructive acts regardless of their source. We also concluded that any inroad on presidential authority that would occur from prohibiting corrupt acts does not undermine the president's ability to fulfill his constitutional mission. The term corruptly sets a demanding standard. It requires a concrete showing that a person acted with an intent to obtain an improper advantage for himself or someone else, inconsistent with official duty and the rights of others. A preclusion of corrupt official action does not diminish the president's ability to exercise Article 2 powers. For example, the proper supervision of criminal law does not demand freedom for the president to act with a corrupt intention of shielding himself from criminal punishment, avoiding financial liability, or preventing personal embarrassment. To the contrary, a statute that prohibits official action undertaken for such corrupt purposes furthers, rather than hinders, the impartial and even-handed administration of the law. It also aligns with the president's constitutional duty to faithfully execute the laws. Finally, we concluded that in the rare case in which a criminal investigation of the president's conduct is justified, inquiries to determine whether the president acted for a corrupt motive should not impermissibly chill his performance of his constitutionally assigned duties. The conclusion that Congress may apply the obstruction laws to the president's corrupt exercises of the powers of office accords with our constitutional system of checks and balances and the principle that no person is above the law.
Conclusion. We here on stage have concluded that the impeachment drink for sale is delicious, and you should try it. It's rum with a peach lemonade and some mint, and it's very good. It's all very good. Put your hands together for Sarah Holgrapher up in the booth. She designed the drink, she designed the slides, and she's running all of her tech. She is a whiz. Now, And thank you to all the bar staff. Please tip the shit out of them. There's not many of us, and we have to make it count. Thank you. Now, yeah, she did have to come in for this. Now, the report's conclusion, because we determined not to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment, we did not draw ultimate conclusions about the President's conduct. The evidence we obtained about the President's actions and intent presents difficult issues that would need to be resolved if we were making a traditional prosecutorial judgment. At the same time, if we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the President clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, we are unable to reach that judgment. I'll say it again. They are unable to reach that judgment. Accordingly, while this report does not conclude that the President committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him.
Section 1. Background legal and evidentiary principles. Subsection A. Legal framework of obstruction of justice. The May 17, 2017 appointment order and the special counsel regulations provide this office with jurisdiction to investigate, quote, federal crimes committed in the course of and with intent to interfere with the special counsel's investigation, such as perjury, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and intimidation of witnesses. Because of that description of our jurisdiction, we sought evidence for our obstruction of justice investigation with the elements of obstruction offenses in mind. Our evidentiary analysis is similarly focused on the elements of such offenses, although we do not draw conclusions on the ultimate questions that govern a prosecutorial decision under the principles of federal prosecution.
Here, we summarize the laws, interpreting the elements of potentially relevant obstruction. All right, these are the laws in the normal case. This discussion does not address the unique constitutional issues that arise in an inquiry into official acts by the President of the United States. Those separate issues are discussed in a whole other chapter. So, 3 basic elements are common to most of the relevant statutes. Number 1, an obstructive act. Number 2, a nexus between the obstructive act and an official legal proceeding. Right. And number 3, a corrupt intent. We describe those elements as they have been interpreted by the courts. We then discuss a more specific statute aimed at witness tampering and describe the requirements for attempted offenses in that one.
There's a metaphor I was supposed to do. Obstruction of justice law reaches all corrupt conduct capable of producing an effect that prevents justice from being duly administered, regardless of the means employed. I had to check if I was on the right page because I fucked up earlier. And I fucked up again. Professional. An effort to influence a proceeding can qualify as an endeavor to obstruct justice, even if the effort was subtle or circuitous, and however cleverly and with whatever cloaking of purpose it was made. The verbs obstruct or impede are broad and can refer to anything that blocks, makes difficult, or hinders. An improper motive can render an actor's conduct criminal even when the conduct would otherwise be lawful within the actor's authority.
Nexus to a pending or contemplated official proceeding. Obstruction of justice law generally requires a nexus or a connection to an official proceeding. In Section 1503, the nexus must be to pending, quote, judicial or grand jury proceedings, end quote. In Section 1505, the nexus can include a connection to a, quote, pending federal agency proceeding, or a congressional inquiry or investigation. Under both statutes, the government must demonstrate, quote, a relationship in time, causation, or logic between the obstructive act and the proceeding or inquiry to be obstructed. Section 1512C prohibits obstructive efforts aimed at official proceedings, including judicial or grand jury proceedings. Quote, for purposes of Section 1512, quote, an official proceeding need not be pending or about to be instituted at the time of the offense, end quote. Although a proceeding need not already be in progress to trigger liability under Section 1512C, a nexus to a contemplated proceeding still must be shown. The nexus requirement narrows the scope of obstruction statutes to ensure that individuals have, quote, fair warning of what the law proscribes. The nexus showing has subjective and objective components. As an objective matter, a defendant must act, quote, in a manner that is likely to obstruct justice, such that the statute, quote, excludes defendants who have an evil purpose but use means that would only unnaturally and improbably be successful, end quote. Yeah. But the endeavor must have the natural and probable effect of interfering with the due administration of justice, end quote. As a subjective matter, the actor must have, quote, contemplated a particular foreseeable proceeding, end quote. A defendant need not directly impede the proceeding. Rather, a nexus exists if, quote, discretionary actions of a third person would be required to obstruct the judicial proceeding if it was foreseeable to the defendant that the third party would act on the defendant's communication in such a way as to obstruct the judicial proceedings.
Corruptly. The word corruptly provides the intent element for obstruction of justice and means acting, quote, knowingly and dishonestly or with an improper motive. United States v. Richardson. As used in Section 1505, the term corruptly means acting with an improper purpose, personally or by influencing another. See also Arthur Anderson. Interpreting corruptly to mean wrongful, immoral, depraved, or evil, and holding that acting, quote, knowingly, corruptly in 18 U.S.C. 1512b requires consciousness of wrongdoing. The requisite showing is made when a person acted with an intent to obtain an improper advantage for himself or someone else, inconsistent with official duty and the rights of others.
Witness tampering. A more specific provision in Section 1512 prohibits tampering with a witness, making it a crime to knowingly use intimidation or corruptly persuade another person or engage in misleading conduct towards another person with the intent to influence, delay, or prevent the testimony of any person in an official proceeding, or to hinder, delay, or prevent the communication to a law enforcement officer of information relating to the commission or possible commission of a federal offense. To establish corrupt persuasion, it is sufficient that the defendant asked a potential witness to lie to investigators in contemplation of a likely federal investigation into his conduct. The persuasion need not be coercive, intimidating, or explicit. It is sufficient to urge, induce, ask, argue, give reasons, or coach or remind witnesses by planting misleading facts. Corrupt persuasion is shown where a defendant tells a potential witness a false story as if the story were true, intending that the witness believe the story and testify to it. It also covers urging a witness to recall a fact that the witness did not know, even if the fact was actually true. Corrupt persuasion also can be shown in certain circumstances when a person with an improper motive urges a witness not to cooperate with law enforcement. When the charge is acting with the intent to hinder, delay, or prevent the communication of information to law enforcement, that an individual have, quote, knowledge that his actions are likely to affect the judicial proceeding does not apply because the obstructive act is aimed at the communication of information to investigators, not at impeding an official proceeding. Acting knowingly, corruptly, requires proof that the individual was conscious of wrongdoing. It is an affirmative defense that the conduct consisted solely of lawful conduct and that the defendant's sole intention was to encourage, induce, or cause the other person to testify truthfully.
Attempts and endeavors. Section 512C2 covers both substantive obstruction offenses and attempts to obstruct justice. Under general principles of attempt law, a person is guilty of an attempt when he has the intent to commit a substantive offense and takes an overt act that constitutes a substantial step towards that goal. See United States versus Resin case. The act must be substantial in that it was strongly corroborative of the defendant's criminal purpose. United States versus Pratt. While mere abstract talk does not suffice, any concrete and specific acts that corroborate the defendant's intent can constitute a substantial step. United States v. Irving. Thus, soliciting an innocent agent to engage in conduct constituting an element of the crime may qualify as a substantial step. The Omnibus Clause of 18 U.S.C. Section 1503 prohibits an endeavor to obstruct justice, which sweeps more broadly than Section 512's attempt provision. See United States versus Sampson. It is well established that an obstruction of justice offense is complete when one corruptly endeavors to obstruct or impede the due administration of justice. The prosecution need not prove that the due administration of justice was actually obstructed or impeded. The United States v. Davis.
Bingo.
Reader cannot pronounce name. Probably one.
Yeah, there you go. All right, so we've got your copy of the Mueller Report coming up for courtesy Jason Romero. All right, I'll keep us going. Section B, investigative and evidentiary considerations. After the appointment of the special counsel, this office obtained evidence about the following events relating to potential issues of obstruction of justice involving the president. A, the president's January 27, 2017 dinner with the former FBI Director James Comey, in which the president reportedly asked for Comey's loyalty, one day after the White House had been briefed by the Department of Justice on contacts between former NSA National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, and the Russian ambassador. B, the president's February 14, 2017 meeting with Comey, in which the president reportedly asked Comey not to pursue an investigation of Flynn. C, the president's private request to Comey to make public the fact that the president was not the subject of an FBI investigation and to lift what the president regarded as a cloud. D, the president's outreach to the Director of National Intelligence and the directors of the National Security Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency about the FBI's Russia investigation. E, the president's stated rationales for terminating Comey on May 9, 2017, including statements that could reasonably be understood as acknowledging that the FBI's Russia investigation was a factor in Comey's termination. And lastly, F, the president's reported involvement in issuing a statement about the June 9, 2016 Trump Tower meeting between Russians and senior Trump campaign officials that said the meeting was about adoption and admitted that the Russians had offered to provide the Trump campaign with derogatory information about Hillary Clinton.
I wish that was it, because we could all go home.
All right, but unfortunately, taking into account that information and our analysis of applicable statutory constitutional principles, we determined that there was a sufficient factual and legal basis to further investigate obstruction of justice issues involving the president. And I think it's further because they got to prove intent. That's the last element, intent. Many of the core issues in an obstruction of justice investigation turn on an individual's actions and intent. We therefore requested that the White House provide us with documentary evidence in its possession on the relevant events to prove intent. We also sought and obtained the White House's concurrence in our conducting interviews of White House personnel who had relevant information, and we interviewed other witnesses who had pertinent knowledge, obtained documents on a mandatory and voluntary basis, and used the legal process where appropriate. These investigative steps allowed us to gather a substantial amount of evidence This is the good stuff coming up.
We also sought a voluntary interview with the president. After more than a year of discussion, the president declined to be interviewed. During the course of our discussion, the president did agree to answer written questions on certain racial-related topics, and he provided us with the answers. He did not similarly agree to provide written answers to questions on obstruction topics or questions on events during the transition. Ultimately, while we believed that we had the authority and legal justification to issue a grand jury subpoena to obtain the president's testimony, we just fucking chose not to do so. We made that decision in view of the substantial delay that such an investigative step would likely produce at a late stage in our investigation, because we don't actually have any fucking authority apparently. You remember when you learned about checks and balances? We also assessed that based on the significant body of evidence, we had already obtained the president's actions in his public and private statements describing or explaining those actions. We had sufficient evidence to understand relevant events and make certain assessments within the president's testimony. I'm just not gonna fucking say it in a sentence. God fucking forbid anybody showing goddamn courage. This is what we go to the camps for. It's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
The office's decision-making process on this issue, I'm not that fucking Texan, is described in more detail in Appendix C, in a note that precedes the president's written responses.
In assessing the evidence we obtained, we relied on common principles that apply in any investigation. The issue of criminal intent is often inferred from circumstantial evidence. See, e.g., United States v. Croteau. Quote, guilty knowledge can rarely be established by direct evidence. Therefore, mens rea elements such as knowledge or intent may be proved by circumstantial evidence. The government's case rested, United States v. Robinson. Quote, the government's case rested on circumstantial evidence, but the mens rea elements of knowledge and intent can often be proved through circumstantial evidence and the reasonable inferences drawn therefrom. End quote. The principle that intent can be inferred from circumstantial evidence is a necessity in criminal cases, given the right of a subject to assert his privilege against compelled self-incrimination under the Fifth Amendment, and therefore decline to testify. Accordingly, determinations on intent are frequently reached without the opportunity to interview an investigatory subject. Obstruction of justice cases are consistent with this rule. See, e.g., Edlund, relying on, quote, significant circumstantial evidence that the defendant was conscious of her wrongdoing, end quote, in an obstruction case. Because evidence of intent will almost always be circumstantial. A defendant may be found culpable where the reasonable and foreseeable consequences of her acts are the obstruction of justice. Circumstantial evidence that illuminates intent may include a pattern of potentially obstructive acts. Fed R. Evid 404b. Quote, evidence of a crime, wrong, or other act may be admissible to prove motive, opportunity, intent, preparation, plan, knowledge, identity, absence of mistake, or lack of accident.
Credibility judgments may also be made based on objective facts and circumstantial evidence. Standard jury instructions highlight a variety of factors that are often relevant in assessing credibility. These include whether a witness had a reason not to tell the truth, check. Whether the witness had a good memory, the best. Whether the witness had the opportunity to observe the events about which he testified, whether the witness's testimony was corroborated by other witnesses, and whether anything the witness said or wrote previously contradicts his testimony. In addition to those general factors, we took into account more specific factors in assessing the credibility of conflicting accounts of the fact. For example, contemporaneously written notes can provide strong corroborating evidence. President doesn't like people taking notes. Why are you taking notes? Why are you taking notes? What are you writing down? See United States v. Noble. The fact that a statement appeared in the contemporaneously recorded report would tend strongly to corroborate the investigator's version of the interview. Similarly, a witness's recitation of his account before he had any motive to fabricate also supports the witness's credibility. See Tome v. United States. A consistent statement that predates the motive is a square rebuttal of the charge that the testimony was contrived as a consequence of that motive. Finally, a witness's false description of an encounter can imply consciousness of wrongdoing. See Al-Adidi v. Obama, noting the well-settled principle that false exculpatory statements are evidence, often strong evidence of guilt. We applied those settled legal principles in evaluating the factual results of our investigation.
Results of the obstruction investigation. This section of the report details the evidence we obtained. We first provide an overview of how Russia became an issue in the 2016 presidential election and how candidate Trump responded. We then turn to key events that we investigated: the president's conduct concerning the FBI investigation of Michael Flynn, the president's reaction to public confirmation of the FBI's Russia investigation, events leading up to and surrounding the termination of FBI Director Comey, efforts to terminate the special counsel, efforts to curtail the scope of the special counsel's investigation, efforts to prevent disclosure of information about the June 9, 2016 Trump Tower meeting between Russians and senior campaign officials, efforts to have the Attorney General unrecused, and conduct towards McGahn, Cohen, and other witnesses. We summarize the evidence we found and then analyze it by reference to the three statutory obstruction of justice elements: obstructive act, nexus to a proceeding, and intent. We focus on elements because by regulation, the special counsel has jurisdiction to investigate federal crimes committed in the course of and with intent to interfere with the special counsel's investigation, such as perjury, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and intimidation of witnesses. Consistent with our jurisdiction to investigate federal obstruction crimes, we gathered evidence that is relevant to the elements of those crimes and analyze them within an elements framework, while refraining from reaching ultimate conclusions about whether crimes were committed for the reasons explained above. This section also does not address legal and constitutional defenses raised by counsel for the president. Those defenses are analyzed in Volume 2, Section 3.
Section A, the campaign's response to reports about Russian support for Trump. During the 2016 campaign, the media raised questions about a possible connection between the Trump campaign and Russia. The questions intensified after WikiLeaks released politically damaging Democratic Party emails that were reported to have been hacked by Russia. Trump responded to questions about possible connections to Russia. Hooray! We've given the report away, but congratulations and thank you for paying attention. The report's also available for free online. We can also talk about some other things after the wink, wink, nudge, nudge, as they say. The questions intensified after WikiLeaks released politically damaging Democratic Party emails that were reported to have been hacked by Russia. Trump responded to questions about possible connections to Russia by denying any business involvement in Russia, even though the Trump organization had pursued a business project in Russia as late as June 2016. Trump also expressed skepticism that Russia had hacked the emails at the same time as he and other campaign advisors privately sought information redacted about any further planned WikiLeaks releases. After the election, when questions persisted about possible links between Russia and the Trump campaign, the president-elect continued to deny any connections to Russia and privately expressed concerns that reports of Russia election interference might lead the public to question the legitimacy of his election. Next part. Did I miss something? Footnote. Number 8? That's not highlighted on mine. Footnote number 8. As discussed in Volume 1, while the investigation identified numerous links between individuals with ties to the Russian government and individuals associated with the Trump campaign, the evidence was not sufficient to charge that any member of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the representatives of the Russian government to interfere in the 2016 election because they were too dumb to do it.
Yeah, All right, subsection 1. Press reports allege links between the Trump campaign and Russia. On June 16, 2015, Donald J. Trump declared his intent to seek nomination as the Republican candidate for president. By early 2016, he distinguished himself among Republican candidates by speaking of closer ties with Russia, saying he would get along very well with Russian President Vladimir Putin, questioning whether the NATO alliance was obsolete, and praising Putin as a strong leader. The press reported that Russian political analysts and commentators perceived Trump as favorable to Russia. Beginning in February 2016 and continuing through the summer, the media reported that several Trump campaign advisors appeared to have ties to Russia. For example, the press reported that campaign advisor Michael Flynn was seated next to Vladimir Putin at an RT gala in Moscow in December 2015, and that Flynn had appeared regularly on RT as an analyst. The press also reported that foreign policy advisor Carter Page had ties to a Russian state-run gas company, and that campaign chairman Paul Manafort had done work for the Russian-backed former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. In addition, the press raised questions during the Republican National Convention about the Trump campaign's involvement in changing the Republican platform stance on giving weapons to Ukraine to fight Russian and rebel forces.
The Trump campaign reacts to WikiLeaks' release of hacked emails. On June 14, 2016, a cybersecurity firm that had conducted in-house analysis for the Democratic National Committee posted an announcement that Russian government hackers had infiltrated the DNC's computer and obtained access to documents. On July 22, 2016, the day before the Democratic National Convention, WikiLeaks posted thousands of hacked DNC documents revealing sensitive internal deliberations. Soon thereafter, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager publicly contended that Russia had hacked the DNC emails and arranged their release in order to help candidate Trump. On July 26, 2016, the New York Times reported that U.S., quote, intelligence agencies had told the White House that they now have high confidence that the Russian government was behind the theft of emails and documents from the Democratic National Committee.
Within the Trump campaign, aides reacted with enthusiasm to reports of the hacks. Redacted. Discussed with campaign officials that WikiLeaks would release the hacked material. Number 24 footnote is Gates 41118 302. I don't know what any of these. There's no possible way I'm going to plug it in.
Skip that one.
Yeah, you can skip that one.
Thank you, Some witnesses said that Trump himself discussed the possibility of upcoming releases, redacted. Michael Cohen, then executive vice president of the Trump Organization and special counsel of Trump, recalled hearing. That's fucking redacted. Cohen recalled that Trump responded, "Oh, good. All right. So, I mean, you gotta see me fucking shit."
I mean, it could have been something racist, and it's just like that.
With redacted. Manafort said that shortly after WikiLeaks' July 22, 2016 release of hacked documents, he spoke to Trump. That's fucking redacted. Manafort recalled that Trump responded, fucking no, we'll never fucking know. Manafort should, to keep Trump updated. Listening to your parents fight through the wall. You're divorced, but you don't know if it's yes or no. Deputy campaign manager Rick Gates said that Manafort was getting pressure about redacted information, and that Manafort instructed Gates redacted status updates on upcoming releases. Around the same, I'm just reading words and they fucking meaningless. Around the same time, Gates was with Trump on a trip to an airport. That's redacted. And shortly after the call ended, Trump told Gates more releases of damaging information would be coming. Redacted were discussing within the campaign, and in the summer of 2016, the campaign was planning a communication strategy based on the possible release of Clinton emails by WikiLeaks. So a lot of secret shit happened in their department.
So 3. The Trump campaign reacts to allegations that Russia was seeking to aid candidate Trump. In the days that followed WikiLeaks' July 22, 2016 release of hacked DNC emails, the Trump campaign publicly rejected suggestions that Russia was seeking to aid candidate Trump. On July 26, 2016, Trump tweeted that it was, quote, crazy to suggest that Russia was, quote, dealing with Trump, and that, quote, for the record, he had, quote, 0 investments in Russia. In a press conference the next day, July 27, 2016, Trump characterized, quote, this whole thing with Russia, quote, as, quote, a total deflection, quote, and stated that it was, quote, far-fetched and, quote, ridiculous. Trump said that the assertion that Russia had hacked the emails was unproven, but stated that it would give him, quote, no pause if Russia had Clinton's emails. Trump added, quote, Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press. Footnote 36. Within 5 hours of Trump's remark, a Russian intelligence service began targeting email accounts associated with Hillary Clinton for possible hacks. In written answers submitted in this investigation, the president stated that he made the, quote, Russia if you're listening, quote, statement, quote, in jest and sarcastically, as was apparent to any objective of the survey, end quote. Trump also said that, quote, there's nothing that I can think of that I'd rather do than have Russia friendly as opposed to the way they are right now, quote. And in response to a question about whether he would recognize Crimea as Russian territory and consider lifting sanctions, Trump replied, quote, we'll be looking at that. Yeah, we'll be looking. Footnote 37. In his written answers submitted in this investigation, the president said that his statement that, quote, we'll be looking, quote, at Crimea and sanctions, quote, did not communicate any position, end quote. During the press conference, Trump repeated, quote, I have nothing to do with Russia, quote, 5 times. He stated that, quote, the closest he came to Russia, quote, was that Russians may have purchased a home or condos from him. He said that after he held the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow in 2013, he had been interested in working with Russian companies that, quote, wanted to put a lot of money into developments in Russia, quote, but, quote, it never worked out, quote. He explained, quote, frankly, I didn't want to do it for a couple of different reasons, but we had a major developer that wanted to develop property in Moscow and other places, but we decided not to do it, end quote. The Trump organization, however, had been pursuing a building project in Moscow, the Trump Tower Moscow project, from approximately September 2015 through June 2016, and the candidate was regularly updated on developments, including possible trips by Michael Cohen to Moscow to promote the deal, and by Trump himself to finalize it.
Cohen recalled speaking with Trump after the press conference about Trump's denial of any business dealings in Russia, which Cohen regarded as untrue. Trump told Cohen that Trump Tower Moscow was not a deal yet and said, why mention it if it's not a deal? According to Cohen, at around this time, in response to Trump's disavowal of connections to Russia, campaign advisors had developed a, quote, party line that Trump had no business with Russia, no connections to Russia. In addition to denying any connections with Russia, the Trump campaign reacted to reports of Russian election interference in aid of the campaign by seeking to distance itself from Russian contacts. For example, in August 2016, Foreign Policy Advisor J.D. Gordon declined an invitation to Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak's residence because the timing was, quote, not optimal in view of media reports about Russian interference. On August 19, 2016, Manafort was asked to resign amid media coverage scrutinizing his ties to the pro-Russian political party in Ukraine and links to Russian business. And when the media published stories about Page's connection to Russia in September 2016, Trump campaign officials terminated Page's association with campaign and told the press that he had played no role in the campaign.
On October 7th, 2016, WikiLeaks released the first set of emails stolen by a Russian intelligence agency from Clinton campaign chairman John Podesta. The same day, the federal government announced that the Russian government directed the recent compromise of emails from U.S. persons and institutions, including from U.S. political organizations. The government statement directly linked Russian hacking to the releases on WikiLeaks with the goal of interfering with the presidential election, and concluded that only Russia's senior-most officials could have authorized these activities based on their scope and sensitivity. On October 11, 2016, Podesta stated publicly that the FBI was investigating Russia's hacking and said that candidate Trump might have known in advance that the hacked emails were going to be released. Vice presidential candidate Mike Pence was asked whether the Trump campaign was in cahoots with WikiLeaks and releasing damaging Clinton-related information, and responded, "Nothing could be further from the truth."
I like that whoever was talking to Mike Pence knew to speak to him in the 1950s vernacular. Subsection 4. After the election, Trump continues to deny any contacts or connections with Russia or that Russia aided his election, which they did. On November 8, 2016, Trump was elected president. 2 days later, Russian officials told the press that the Russian government had maintained contacts with Trump's immediate entourage during the campaign. In response, Hope Hicks, who had been the Trump campaign spokesperson, said, quote, "We are not aware of any campaign representatives that were in touch with any foreign entities before yesterday when Mr. Trump spoke with many world leaders," end quote. Hicks gave an additional statement denying any contacts between the campaign and Russia, quote, "It never happened. There was no communication between the campaign and any foreign entity during the campaign." Footnote 56. Jim Heintz and Matthew Lee. Russia eyes better ties with Trump. Says contacts underway. Associated Press, November 10, 2016, quoting Hicks. Hicks recalled that after she made that statement, she spoke with campaign advisors Kellyanne Conway, Stephen Miller, Jason Miller, and probably Kushner and Bannon, just to make sure they were all the worst fucking people, to ensure it was accurate, and there was no hesitation or pushback from any of them. Hicks, 12/18/17.
On December 10, 2016, the press reported that U.S. intelligence agencies had, quote, concluded that Russia interfered in last month's presidential election to boost Donald Trump's bid for the White House, end quote. Reacting to the story the next day, President-elect Trump stated, "I think it's ridiculous. I think it's just another excuse." He continued that no one really knew who was responsible for the hacking, suggesting that the intelligence community had, quote, no idea if it's Russia or China or somebody. It could be somebody sitting in a bed someplace, end quote. The president-elect also said the Democrats were, quote, putting out the story of Russian interference because they suffered one of the greatest defeats in the history of politics, which is false. On December 18, 2016, Podesta told the press that the election was, quote, distorted by the Russian intervention and questioned whether Trump campaign officials had been in touch with the Russians. The same day, incoming Chief of Staff Reince Priebus appeared on Fox News Sunday and declined to say whether the president-elect accepted the intelligence community's determination that Russia intervened in the election. When asked about any contact or coordination between the campaign and Russia, Priebus said, "Even this question is insane. Of course we didn't interface with the Russians." Priebus added that this whole thing is a spin job, and said the real question is why the Democrats are doing everything they can to delegitimize the outcome of the election.
We should do that. On December 29, 2016, the Obama administration announced, God, that sounds good, the Obama administration. They announced that in response to Russian cyber operations aimed at the U.S. election, they were imposing sanctions and other measures on several Russian individuals and identities. When first asked about the sanctions, President-elect Trump said, I think we ought to get on with our lives. He then put out a statement that said, quote, it's time for our country to move on to bigger and better things, but indicated that he would meet with intelligence community leaders the following week for a briefing on Russian interference. The briefing occurred on January 6, 2017. Following the briefing, the intelligence community released the public version of its assessment, which concluded with high confidence that Russia had intervened in the election through a variety of means with the goal of harming Clinton's electability. Not hard to do. The assessment further concluded with high confidence that Putin and the Russian government had developed a clear preference for Trump. Several days later, BuzzFeed published unverified allegations compiled by former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele during the campaign about candidate Trump's Russia connections under the headline, "These reports allege Trump has deep ties to Russia." In a press conference the next day, the president-elect called the release, quote, "an absolute disgrace," and said, "I have no dealings with Russia. I have no deals that could happen in Russia because we've stayed away. So I have deals. I have no loans. I have no dealings. We can make deals in Russia very easily if I wanted to. I just don't want to because that would be a conflict."
I'll take things a totally innocent person would say for 500
You guys realize, like, when he watched Rocky, he was rooting for Ivan Drago. And, like, that is basically everything we're experiencing right now. Is he thought that guy was strong and Rocky was kind of a pussy. And here we are.
Definitely when he watched Creed 2.
You think he watched Creed 2? Yeah.
Because Adonis Creed is black.
Yeah, my stepdad hated that guy too. And he was just a racist thing. Anytime like Rocky won. Several advisors recalled the president-elect viewed stories about his Russian connections and Russian investigations and the intelligence community assessment of Russian interference as a threat to the legitimacy of his electoral victory. Number 73 is thankfully crossed out so we don't have to experience that again. Hicks, for example, said the president-elect viewed the intelligence community assessment of his Achilles heel because even if Russia had no impact on the election, people would think Russia helped him win, taking away from what he had accomplished. Sean Spicer, the first White House communications director, recalled that the president thought the Russian story was developed to undermine the legitimacy of his election. Gates said the president viewed the Russian investigation as an attack on the legitimacy of his win. And Priebus recalled that when the intelligence assessment came out, President-elect was concerned people would question the legitimacy of his win.
B. The President's conduct concerning the investigation of Michael Flynn. Overview. During the presidential transition, incoming National Security Advisor Michael Flynn had 2 phone calls with the Russian ambassador to the United States about the Russian response to U.S. sanctions imposed because of Russia's election interference. After the press reported on Flynn's contacts with the Russian ambassador, Flynn lied to incoming administration officials by saying he had not discussed sanctions on the calls. The officials publicly repeated those lies in press interviews. The FBI, which previously was investigating Flynn for other matters, interviewed him about the calls in the first week after the inauguration, and Flynn told similar lies to the FBI. On January 26, 2017, Department of Justice officials notified the White House that Flynn and the Russian ambassador had discussed sanctions and that Flynn had been interviewed by the FBI. The next night, the president had a private dinner with FBI Director James Comey, in which he asked for Comey's loyalty. On February 13, 2017, the president asked Flynn to resign. The following day, the president had a one-on-one conversation with Comey, in which he said, quote, "I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go." End quote.
Evidence. Number 1. Incoming National Security Advisor Flynn discusses sanctions on Russia with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak. Shortly after the election, President-elect Trump announced he would appoint Michael Flynn as his National Security Advisor. For the next 2 months, Flynn played an active role on the President Transition Team, PTT, coordinating policy positions and communicating with foreign government officials, including Russian Ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak. On December 29, 2016, as noted in Volume 2, Section 2A4, SUPRA, the Obama administration announced that it was imposing sanctions and other measures on several Russian individuals and entities. That day, multiple members of the PTT exchanged emails about the sanctions and the impact they would have on the incoming administration, and Flynn informed members of the PTT that he would be speaking to the Russian ambassador later in the day. Footnote 81, 12/29/16 email, O'Brien to McFarland et al. Text message, Flynn Flaherty. Tit for tat with Russia, not good. Russia, Ambo, reaching out to me today. Flynn, who was in the Dominican Republic at the time, and K.T. McFarland, who was slated to become the Deputy National Security Advisor and was at the Mar-a-Lago Resort in Florida with the President-elect and other senior staff, talked by phone about what, if anything, Flynn would communicate to Kislyak about the sanctions. McFarland had spoken with incoming administration officials about the sanctions and Russia's possible responses. If not, she had mentioned in those conversations that Flynn was scheduled to speak with Kislyak. Based on those conversations, McFarland informed Flynn that incoming administration officials at Mar-a-Lago did not want Russia to escalate the situation. At 4:43 p.m. that afternoon, McFarland sent an email to several officials about the sanctions and informed the group that General Flynn is talking to Russian ambassador this evening.
Approximately 1 hour later, McFarland met with the president-elect and senior officials and briefed them on the sanctions and Russia's possible responses. Incoming Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, recalled that McFarland may have mentioned at the meeting that the sanctions situation could be cooled down and not escalated. McFarland recalled that at the end of the meeting, someone may have mentioned to the president-elect that Flynn was speaking to the Russian ambassador that evening. McFarland did not recall any response by the president-elect. Priebus recalled that the president-elect viewed the sanctions as an attempt by the Obama administration to embarrass him by delegitimizing his election. Immediately after discussing the sanctions with McFarland on December 29, 2016, Flynn called Kislyak and requested that Russia respond to the sanctions only in a reciprocal manner without escalating the situation. After the call, Flynn briefed McFarland on its substance. Flynn told McFarland that the Russian response to the sanctions was not going to be escalatory because Russia wanted a good relationship with the Trump administration. On December 30th, 2016, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that Russia would not take retaliatory measures in response to the sanctions at the time and would instead plan further steps to restore Russian-U.S. relations based on the policies of the Trump administration. Following that announcement, the president-elect tweeted, "Great move on delay by V. Putin. I always knew he was very smart."
Yep. Anybody angry yet? On December 31st, 2016, Kislyak called Flynn and told him that Flynn's request had been received at the highest levels, and Russia had chosen not to retaliate in response to the request. Later that day, Flynn told McFarland about his follow-up conversation with Kislyak and Russia's decision not to escalate the sanctions situation based on Flynn's request. McFarland recalled that Flynn thought his phone call had made a difference. Flynn spoke with other incoming administration officials that day, but does not recall whether they discussed the sanctions. Flynn recalled discussing the sanctions issue with incoming administration official Stephen Bannon the next day. Flynn said that Bannon appeared to know about Flynn's conversation with Kislyak, and he and Bannon agreed that they had, quote, stopped the train on Russia's response, end quote, to the sanctions. On January 3rd, 2017, Flynn saw the president-elect in person and thought they discussed the Russian reaction to the sanctions, but Flynn did not have a specific recollection of telling the president-elect about the substance of his calls with Kislyak. Members of the intelligence community were surprised by Russia's decision not to retaliate in response to the sanctions. When analyzing Russia's response, they became aware of Flynn's discussion of sanctions with Kislyak. That's a crime, by the way. He shouldn't have done that. Previously, the FBI had opened an investigation of Flynn based on his relationship with the Russian government. Flynn's contacts with Kislyak became a key component of that investigation because they were illegal.
Subsection 2. President-elect Trump is briefed on the intelligence community's assessment of Russian interference in the election, and Congress opens election interference investigations. On January 6, 2017, intelligence officials briefed President-elect Trump and the incoming administration on the intelligence community's assessment that Russia had interfered in the 2016 presidential election. When the briefing concluded, Comey spoke with the president-elect privately to brief him on an unverified, personally sensitive allegation compiled by Steele. According to a memorandum Comey drafted immediately after their private discussion, the president-elect began the meeting by telling Comey he had conducted himself honorably over the prior year and had a great reputation. The president-elect stated that he thought highly of Comey, looked forward to working with him, and hoped that he planned to stay on as FBI director. Comey responded that he intended to continue serving in that role. Comey then briefed the president-elect on the sensitive material in question. Footnote 112. Comey's briefing included the Steele reporting's unverified allegation that the Russians had compromising tapes of the president involving conduct when he was a private citizen during a 2013 trip to Moscow for the Miss Universe pageant. During the 2016 presidential campaign, a similar claim may have reached candidate Trump. On October 30th, 2016, Michael Cohen received a text from Russian businessman Georgy, last name I can't pronounce, that said, quote, "Stopped flow of tapes from Russia, but not sure if there's anything else. Just so you know, ... end quote. 3:16 text message to Cohen. He also said, quote, tapes referred to compromising tapes of Trump rumored to be held by persons associated with the Russian real estate conglomerate Crocus Group, which had helped host. Comey recalled that the president-elect seemed defensive, so Comey decided to assure him that the FBI was not investigating him personally. Comey recalled that he did not want the president-elect to think of the conversation as, quote, a J. Edgar Hoover move.
All right, on January 10, 2017, the media reported that Comey had briefed the president-elect on the Steele reporting, and BuzzFeed News published information compiled by Steele online, stating that the information included specific, unverified, and potentially unverifiable allegations of contact between Trump aides and Russian operatives. The next day, the president-elect expressed concern to intelligence community leaders about the fact that the information had leaked and asked whether they could make public statements refuting the allegations in the Steele reports. I remember when that happened, and they're like, nah, we're not going to refute that. And we'd rather not do that. In the following weeks, 3 congressional committees opened investigations to examine Russia's interference in the election and whether the Trump campaign had colluded with Russia. On January 13, 2017, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence announced that it would conduct a bipartisan inquiry into Russian interference in the election, including any, quote, links between Russia and individuals associated with political campaigns. On January 25, 2017, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence announced that it had been conducting an investigation into Russian election interference and possible coordination with the political campaigns. Yeah, that was the one that Devin Nunes was running. On February 2nd, 2017, the Senate Judiciary Committee announced that it too would investigate Russian efforts to intervene in the election.
The 2015 Miss Universe pageant in Russia. There's a Russian word and it says 4418302 at 12. Cohen said he spoke to Trump about the issue after receiving the text from that dude. Cohen, 912-302 at 13. Russian dude said he was told the tapes were fake, but did not communicate that to Cohen. It may not be a Russian dude, it's a good dude.
Those were the P tapes.
By the way,
I'm sorry, Lauren.
that's right, me. Just throw away. Top page 29.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm so sorry. Flynn makes false statements about his communications with Kislyak to incoming administration officials, the media, and the FBI. This is the fun part. On January 12, 2017, a Washington Post columnist reported that Flynn and Kislyak communicated on the day the Obama administration announced the Russian sanctions. The column questioned whether Flynn had said something to undercut the U.S. sanctions, and whether Flynn's communications had violated the letter or spirit of the Logan Act. Do we need the Logan Act? We do? Okay, good. President-elect Trump called Priebus after the story was published and expressed anger about it. Priebus recalled that the president-elect asked, "What the hell is this about?" Priebus called Flynn and told him the president-elect was angry about the reporting on Flynn's conversations with Kislyak. Flynn recalled that he felt a lot of pressure because Priebus had spoken to the boss, and said Flynn needed to kill the story. Flynn directed McFarland to call the Washington Post columnist and inform him that no discussion of sanctions had occurred. McFarland recalled that Flynn said the words to the effect of, "I want to kill the story." McFarland made the call as Flynn had requested, although she knew she was providing false information, and the Washington Post updated the column to reflect that a Trump official had denied that Flynn and Kislyak discussed sanctions.
When Priebus and other incoming administration officials questioned Flynn internally about the Washington Post column, Flynn maintained that he had not discussed sanctions with Kislyak. Flynn repeated that claim to Vice President-elect Michael Pence and to incoming Press Secretary Sean Spicer. In subsequent media interviews in mid-January, Pence, Priebus, and Spicer denied that Flynn and Kislyak had discussed sanctions, basing those denials on their conversations with Flynn. The public statements of incoming administration officials denying that Flynn and Kislyak had discussed sanctions alarmed senior DOJ officials who were aware that the statements were not true. Those officials were concerned that Flynn had lied to his colleagues, who in turn had unwittingly misled the American public, entirely unwittingly, creating a compromise situation for Flynn because the Department of Justice assessed that the Russian government could prove Flynn lied. The FBI investigative team also believed that Flynn's calls with Kislyak and subsequent denials about discussing sanctions raised potential Logan Act issues and were relevant to the FBI's broader Russian investigation.
The guy's a traitor. No doubt.
On January 20th, 2017, President Trump was inaugurated, and Flynn was sworn in as National Security Advisor. On January 23, 2017, Spicer delivered his first press briefing. Oh, do you remember those? We were so much younger than that. He stated he had spoken with Flynn the night before, who confirmed that the calls with Kislyak were about topics unrelated to sanctions. Spicer's statements added to the Department of Justice's concerns that Russia had leverage over Flynn based on his lies and could use that derogatory information to compromise him. On January 24, 2017, Flynn agreed to be interviewed by agents from the FBI. During the interview, which took place at the White House, Flynn falsely stated that he did not ask Kislyak to refrain from escalating the situation in response to the sanctions on Russia imposed by the Obama administration. Flynn also falsely stated that he did not remember a follow-up conversation in which Kislyak stated that Russia had chosen to moderate its response to those sanctions as a result of Flynn's request.
Section 4. DOJ officials notify the White House of their concerns about Flynn. On January 26, 2017, Acting Attorney General Sally Yates contacted White House counsel Donald McGahn and informed him that she needed to discuss a sensitive matter with him in person. Later that day, Yates and Mary McCord, a senior national security official at the Department of Justice, met at the White House with McGahn and White House counsel's office attorney James Burnham. Yates said that the public statements made by the Vice President denying that Flynn and Kislyak discussed sanctions were not true and put Flynn in a potentially compromised position because the Russians would know that he had lied. Yates disclosed that Flynn had been interviewed by the FBI. She declined to answer a specific question about how Flynn had performed during that interview, but she indicated that Flynn's statements to the FBI were similar to the statements he had made to Pence and Spicer denying that he had discussed sanctions. McGahn came away from the meeting with the impression that the FBI had not pinned Flynn down in lies, but he asked John Eisenberg, who served as a legal advisor to the National Security Council, to examine potential legal issues raised by Flynn's FBI interview and his contacts with Kislyak.
That very afternoon, McGahn notified the president that Yates had come to the White House to discuss concerns about Flynn. McGahn described what Yates had told him, and the president asked him to repeat it, so he did. McGahn recalled that when he described the FBI interview to Flynn, interview of Flynn, he said that Flynn did not disclose having discussed sanctions with Kislyak, but there may not have been a clear violation of 18 U.S.C. 1001. The president asked about the section 1001 and McGahn explained the law to him and also explained the Logan Act. The president instructed McGahn to work with Priebus and Bannon to look into the matter further and directed that they not discuss it with any other officials. Priebus recalled that the president was angry with Flynn in light of what Yates had told the White House and said, "Not again, this guy, this stuff." That evening, the president dined with several senior advisors and asked the group what they thought about FBI Director Comey. According to Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates, who was at the dinner, no one openly advocated terminating Comey, but the consensus on him was not positive. Coates told the group that he thought Comey was a good director. Coates encouraged the president to meet Comey face-to-face and spend time with him before making a decision about whether to retain him. I got a footnote? Which one? Thank you. Priebus, 10/13/17, et al. 8. Several witnesses said that the president was unhappy with Flynn for other reasons at this time. Bannon said that Flynn's standing with the president was not good by December 2016. The president-elect had concerns because President Obama had warned him about Flynn shortly after the election. President Obama's comments sat with President-elect Trump more than Hicks expected. Priebus said that the president had become unhappy with Flynn even before the story of his calls with Kislyak broke, and had become so upset with Flynn that he would not look at him during intelligence briefings. Priebus said that at some point. Hicks said that the president thought Flynn had bad judgment and was angered by tweets sent by Flynn and his son, and she described Flynn as being on thin ice by early February 2017. That's according to Hope Hicks. Everybody, we're going to take a break.
With McGann.
McGann has a follow-up?
Yep, McGann has a follow-up meeting about Flynn with Yates. President Trump has dinner with FBI Director Comey. The next day, January 27, 2017, McGann and Eisenberg discussed the results of Eisenberg's initial legal research into Flynn's conduct, and specifically whether Flynn may have violated the Espionage Act, the Logan Act, or 18 U.S.C. Subsection 1001. Based on his preliminary research, Eisenberg informed McGann, I keep doing that there was a possibility that Flynn had violated U.S. Code and the Logan Act. Eisenberg noted that the United States had never successfully prosecuted an individual under the Logan Act, and that Flynn could have possible defenses, and told McGann that he believed it was unlikely that a prosecutor would pursue a Logan Act charge under the circumstances.
According to Comey's account, at one point during the dinner, the president stated, "I need your loyalty. I expect loyalty." Comey did not respond. The conversation moved on to other topics. But the president returned to the subject of Comey's job at the end of the dinner and repeated, "I need loyalty." Comey responded, "You will always get honesty from me." The president said, "That's what I want, honest loyalty." Comey said, "You will get that from me." After Comey's account of the dinner became public, the president and his advisors disputed that he had asked for Comey's loyalty. The president also indicated that he had not invited Comey to dinner, telling a reporter that he thought Comey had asked for the dinner. Man, that is petty, because he wanted to stay on. But substantial evidence corroborates Comey's account of the dinner invitation and the request for loyalty. The president's daily diary confirms that the president extended a dinner invitation to Comey on January 27th. There is nothing he won't lie about. With respect to the substance of the dinner conversation, Comey documented the president's request for loyalty in a memorandum he began drafting the night of the dinner. Senior FBI officials recall that Comey told them about the loyalty request shortly after the dinner occurred. So Comey's doing a Me Too thing on Trump. And Comey described the request while under oath in congressional proceedings and in a subsequent interview with investigators subject to penalties for lying under perjury clause. Comey's memory of the details of the dinner, including that the president requested loyalty, has remained consistent throughout. He did it.
That same morning, but a little bit back, McGann asked Yates to return to the White House to discuss Flynn again. In that second meeting, McGann expressed doubts that the Department of Justice would bring a Logan Act prosecution against Flynn, but stated the White House did not want to take action that would interfere with an ongoing FBI investigation of Flynn. Yates responded to that Yates responded that the Department of Justice had notified the White House so he could take action in response to the information provided. McGann ended the meeting by asking Yates for access to the underlying information the Department of Justice possessed pertaining to Flynn's discussions with Kislyak. Also on January 27th, the president called FBI Director Comey and invited him to dinner that evening. Remus recalled that before the dinner, he told the president something like, "Don't talk about Russia, whatever you do." The president promised he would not talk about Russia at the dinner. McGahn had previously advised the president that he should not communicate directly with the Department of Justice to avoid the perception or reality of political interference to law enforcement. When Bannon learned about the president's planned dinner with Comey, he suggested that he and Priebus also attend babysit, but the president stated that he wanted to dine with Comey alone. Comey said that when he arrived for the dinner that evening, he was surprised and concerned to see no one else had been invited.
Victorian drama.
Comey provided an account of the dinner in a contemporaneous memo and interview with this office and congressional testimony. According to Comey's account of the dinner, the president repeatedly brought up Comey's future, asking whether he wanted to stay on as FBI director. Because the president had previously said he wanted Comey to stay on as FBI director, Comey interpreted the president's comments as an effort to create a patronage relationship by having Comey ask for his job. The president also brought up the Steele reporting that Comey had raised in the January 6, 2017 briefing, and stated that he was thinking about ordering the FBI to investigate the allegations to prove they were false. Comey responded that the president should think carefully about issuing such an order because it could create a narrative that the FBI was investigating him personally, which was incorrect. Later in the dinner, the president brought up Flynn and said, "The guy has serious judgment issues." Comey did not comment on Flynn, and the president did not acknowledge any FBI interest in or contact with Flynn.
And then I go back to the part where I need loyalty, I expect loyalty, that stuff happens. And then Flynn resigns. On February 2nd, 2017, Eisenberg reviewed the underlying information relating to Flynn's calls with Kislyak. Eisenberg recalled that he prepared a memorandum about criminal statutes that could apply to Flynn's conduct, but he did not believe the White House had enough information to make a definitive recommendation to the president. Eisenberg and McGahn discussed that Eisenberg's review of the underlying information confirmed his preliminary conclusion that Flynn was unlikely to be prosecuted for violating the Logan Act. Because White House officials were uncertain about what Flynn had told the FBI, however, they could not assess his exposure to prosecution for violating that law. The week of February 6th, Flynn had a one-on-one conversation with the president in the Oval about the negative media coverage of his contact with Kislyak. Flynn recalled that the president was upset and asked him for information on the conversations. Flynn listed the specific dates on which he remembered speaking with Kislyak, but the president corrected one of the dates he listed. The president asked Flynn when he and Kislyak discussed, and Flynn responded that he might have talked about sanctions.
Maybe a little bit. On February 9, 2017, the Washington Post reported that Flynn discussed sanctions with Kislyak the month before the president took office. After the publication of that story, Vice President Pence learned of the Department of Justice's notification to the White House about the content of Flynn's calls. He and other advisors then sought access to and reviewed the underlying information about Flynn's contacts with Kislyak. FBI Director Andrew McCabe, who provided the White House officials access to the information and was present when they reviewed it, recalled the officials asking him whether Flynn's conduct violated the Logan Act. McCabe responded that he did not know, but the FBI was investigating the matter because it was a possibility. Based on the evidence of Flynn's contacts with Kislyak, McGahn and Priebus concluded that Flynn could not have forgotten the details of the discussion of sanctions and had instead been lying about what he discussed with Kislyak. Lying. Flynn had also told White House officials that the FBI had told him that the FBI was closing out its investigation of him, but Eisenberg did not believe him. After reviewing the materials and speaking with Flynn, McGahn and Priebus concluded that Flynn should be terminated and recommended that course of action to the president. That weekend, Flynn accompanied the president to Mar-a-Lago. Flynn recalled that on February 12, 2017, on the return flight to D.C. on Air Force One, the president asked him whether he had lied to the vice president. Flynn responded that he may have forgotten details of his calls, like we all have, am I right? But he did not think he lied. The president responded, "Okay, that's fine, I got it." On February 13, 2017, Priebus told Flynn that he had to resign. Flynn said he wanted to say goodbye to the president, so Priebus brought him to the Oval Office. I want to say goodbye. Priebus recalled that the president hugged Flynn, shook his hand, and said, quote, "We'll give you a good recommendation. You're a good guy. We'll take care of you," end quote. Talking points on the resignation prepared by the White House counsel's office and distributed by the White House communications team stated that McGahn had advised the president that Flynn was unlikely to be prosecuted, and the president had determined that the issue with Flynn was one of trust. Spicer told, remember that guy, Sean Spicer? What a piece of shit. Spicer told the press the next day that Flynn was forced to resign, quote, "not based on a legal issue, but based on a trust issue," where a level of trust between the president and General Flynn eroded to the point where the president felt he had to make a change, end quote.
Section 7. The President discusses Flynn with FBI Director Comey. On February 14, 2017, the day after Flynn's resignation, the President had lunch at the White House with New Jersey Governor Chris Christie for Valentine's Day. According to Christie, at one point during the lunch, the President said, "Now that we fired Flynn, the Russia thing is over." Christie laughed and responded, "No way." He said, "This Russia thing is far from over, and we'll be here on Valentine's Day 2018 talking about this." The President said, "What do you mean? Flynn met with the Russians. That was the problem. I fired Flynn. It's over." Christie recalled responding that based on his experience both as a prosecutor and as someone who had been investigated, firing Flynn would not end the investigation. Christie said there was no way to make an investigation shorter, but a lot of ways to make it longer. Oh, really, the humor sometimes. Okay. The President asked Christie what he meant, and Christie told the President not to talk about the investigation, even if he was frustrated at times. Christie also told the President that he would never be able to get rid of Flynn like gum on the bottom of your shoe. Footnote 223. Christie also recalled that during the lunch, Flynn called Kushner, who was at the lunch, and complained what Spicer had said. Flynn called Kushner, who was at the lunch, and complained about what Spicer had said about Flynn in his press briefing that day. Kushner told Flynn words to the effect of, quote, "You know the President respects you. The President cares about you. I'll get the President to send out a positive tweet about you later." Kushner looked at the President when he mentioned the tweet, and the President nodded his assent. Flynn recalled getting upset at Spicer's comments at the press conference and calling Kushner to say he did not appreciate the comments.
Wow.
Tweets will fix everything.
This is backstabbing, front stabbing. According to Comey's account of the meeting, once they were alone, the President began the conversation by saying, "I want to talk about Mike Flynn." The President stated that Flynn had not done anything wrong in speaking with the Russians, but had to be terminated because he had misled the Vice President. I remember. The conversation turned to the topic of leaks of classified information, but the President returned to Flynn, saying, "He's a good guy, he's been through a lot. I hope you can see your way clear to letting this guy go, to letting Flynn go. He's a good guy. I hope you can let this go." Comey agreed that Flynn is a good guy, but did not commit to ending the investigation of Flynn. Comey testified under oath that he took the President's statement as a direction because of the President's position and the circumstances of the one-on-one meeting. Shortly after the meeting with the President, Comey began drafting a memorandum documenting their conversation. Comey also met with senior leadership team to discuss the President's request. He knew it was corrupt, and they agreed not to inform FBI officials working on the Flynn case of the President's statement so that officials would not be influenced by the request. Comey also asked for a meeting with Sessions and requested that Sessions not leave Comey alone with the President ever again.
Meanwhile, towards the end of the lunch, the President brought up Comey and asked if Christie was still friendly with him. Christie said he was. The President told Christie to call Comey and tell him that the President really likes him. He's part of the team. And at the end of the lunch, the President repeated his request that Christie reach out to Comey. Christie had no intention of complying with the president's request that he contact Comey. He thought the president's request was nonsensical, and Christie didn't want to put Comey in the position of having to receive such a call. Christie thought it would have been uncomfortable to pass on that message. At 4 p.m. that afternoon, the president met with Comey, Sessions, and other officials for a Homeland Security briefing. At the end of the briefing, the president dismissed the other attendees and stated that he wanted to speak to Comey alone. Sessions and senior advisor to the president, Jared Kushner, remained in the Oval Office as other participants left. The president The president excused him, repeating that he wanted to speak only with Comey. At some point, after the others had left the Oval Office, Priebus opened the door, but the president sent him away.
Number 8. The media raises questions about the president's delay in terminating Flynn. After Flynn was forced to resign, the press raised questions about why the president waited more than 2 weeks after the DOJ notification to remove Flynn, and whether the president had known about Flynn's contacts with Kislyak before the DOJ notification. The press also continued to raise questions about connections between Russia and the president's campaign. On February 15, 2017, the president told reporters, quote, "General Flynn is a wonderful man. I think he's been treated very, very unfairly by the media." End quote. On February 16, 2017, the president held a press conference that said that he removed Flynn because Flynn, quote, "didn't tell the Vice President of the United States the facts, and then he didn't remember. And that just wasn't acceptable to me," end quote. The president said he did not direct Flynn to discuss sanctions with Kislyak, but, quote, "It certainly would have been okay with me if he did. I would have directed him to do it if I thought he wasn't doing it. I didn't direct him, but I would have directed him because that's his job," quote, end quote. In listing the reasons for terminating Flynn, the president did not say that Flynn had lied to him. The president also denied having any connection to Russia, stating, quote, "I have nothing to do with Russia. I told you, I have no deals there. I have no anything," end quote. The president also said that he, quote, "had nothing to do with," quote, "WikiLeaks' publication of information hacked from the Clinton campaign."
Number 9. The president attempts to have Katie McFarland create a witness statement denying that he directed Flynn's discussion with Kislyak. On February 22, 2017, Priebus and Bannon told McFarland that the president wanted her to resign as Deputy National Security Advisor, but they suggested to her that the administration could make her the ambassador to Singapore. The next day, the president asked Priebus to have McFarland draft an internal email that would confirm that the president did not direct Flynn to call the Russian ambassador about sanctions. Priebus said he told the president he would only direct McFarland to write such a letter if she were comfortable with it. Priebus called McFarland into his office to convey the president's request that she memorialize in writing that the president did not direct Flynn to talk to Kislyak. McFarland told Priebus she did not know whether the president had directed Flynn to talk to Kislyak about sanctions, and she declined to say yes or no to the request. Priebus understood that McFarland was not comfortable with the president's request, and he recommended that she talk to attorneys in the White House counsel's office.
Yeah. McFarland then reached out to Eisenberg. McFarland told him that she had been fired from her job as Deputy National Security Advisor and offered the ambassadorship in Singapore, but that the president and Priebus wanted a letter from her denying that the president directed Flynn to discuss sanctions with Kislyak. Eisenberg advised McFarland not to write the requested letter because it would be illegal, as documented by McFarland in a contemporaneous memorandum for the record, end quote, that she wrote because she was concerned by the president's request. Quote, "Eisenberg thought the requested email and letter would be a bad idea. From my side, because the email would be awkward. Why would I be emailing Priebus to make a statement for the record? But it would also be a bad idea for the president because it looked as if my ambassadorial appointment was in some way a quid pro quo," end quote, because it would quote quo. Later that evening, Priebus stopped by McFarland's office and told her not to write the email and to forget he even mentioned it. It's a felony, don't do it. Around the same time, the president asked Priebus to reach out to Flynn and let him know that the president still cared about him deeply. Priebus called Flynn and said that he was checking in and that Flynn was an American hero. because he made a call. Priebus thought the president did not want Flynn saying bad things about him. On March 31st, 2017, following news that Flynn had offered to testify before the FBI and congressional investigators in exchange for immunity, the president tweeted, quote, "Mike Flynn should ask for immunity and that this is a witch hunt, excuse for big election loss by media and Dems of historic proportion," end quote. In late March or early April, the president asked McFarland to pass a message to Flynn telling the president felt bad for him and that he should stay strong. Analysis. In analyzing the president's conduct related to Flynn, In analyzing the president's conduct related to the Flynn investigation, the following evidence is relevant to the elements of obstruction of justice. A. Obstructive act. According to Comey's account of his February 14, 2017 meeting in the Oval Office, also known as Valentine's Day, the president told him, quote, "I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. I hope you can let this go," end quote. In analyzing whether these statements constitute an obstructive act, a threshold question is whether Comey's account of the interaction is accurate, and if so, whether the president's statements had the tendency to impede the administration of justice by shutting down an inquiry that could result in a grand jury investigation and a criminal charge. After Comey's account of the president's request to, quote, "let Flynn go," end quote, became public, the president publicly disputed several aspects of the story. The president told the New York Times that he did not, quote, "shoo other people out of the room," end quote, when he talked to Comey, and that he did not remember having a one-on-one conversation with Comey. The president also publicly denied that he asked Comey to, quote, "let Flynn go," end quote, or otherwise communicated that Comey should drop the investigation of Flynn. In private, the president denied aspects of Comey's account to White House advisors, but acknowledged to Priebus that he brought Flynn up in the meeting with Comey and stated that Flynn was a good guy. Despite those denials, substantial evidence corroborates Comey's account.
First, Comey wrote a detailed memorandum of his encounter with the president on the same day it occurred, because he doesn't trust him. Comey also told senior FBI officials about the meeting with the president that day, and their recollection of what Comey told them at the time is consistent with Comey's account. Second, Comey provided testimony about the president's request that he, quote, "let Flynn go," under oath in congressional proceedings, and in interviews with federal investigators subject to penalties for lying under U.S. Code. Comey's recollections of the encounter have remained consistent over time. Third, the objective, corroborated circumstances of how the one-on-one meeting came to occur support Comey's description of the event. Comey recalled that the president cleared the room to speak with Comey alone after a Homeland Security briefing in the Oval Office, that Kushner and Sessions lingered and had to be shooed out by the president, and that Priebus briefly opened the door during the meeting, prompting the president to wave him away. While the president has publicly denied those details, other administration officials who were present have confirmed Comey's account of how he ended up in a one-on-one meeting with the president. And the president acknowledged to Priebus and McGahn that he in fact spoke to Comey about Flynn in their one-on-one meeting.
Fourth, the president's decision to clear the room, and in particular to exclude the Attorney General from the meeting, as if you had to wonder who's telling the truth, Comey or Trump, signals that the president wanted to be alone with Comey, which is consistent with the delivery of a message of the type that Comey recalls, rather than a mere innocuous conversation that could have occurred in the presence of the Attorney General. Again, Trump's the liar here? Finally, Comey's reaction to the president's statement is inconsistent with the president having asked him to, quote, "let Flynn go." Comey met with the FBI leadership team, which agreed to keep the president's statements closely held and not to inform the team working on the Flynn investigation so that they would not be influenced by the president's request. Comey also promptly met with the Attorney General to ask him not to be left alone with the president again. An account verified by Sessions, FBI Chief of Staff James Ripken, and Jody Hunt, who was then the Attorney General's Chief of Staff.
The second question is whether the president's statements, which were not phrased as a direct order to Flynn, could impede or interfere with the FBI's investigation of Flynn. While the president said he hoped Comey could let Flynn go, rather than affirmatively directing him to do so, the circumstances of the conversation show the President was asking Comey to close the FBI's investigation into Flynn. First, the President arranged a meeting with Comey so that they would be alone and purposefully excluded the Attorney General, which suggests that the President meant to make a request to Comey that he did not want anyone else to hear. Second, because the President is the head of the executive branch, when he says that he hopes a subordinate will do something, it is reasonable to expect that the subordinate will do what the President wants. Indeed, the President repeated a version of "let this go" 3 times, and Comey testified that he understood the President's statements as a directive, which is corroborated by the way Comey reacted at the time.
Comey's telling.
Paragraph B. Nexus to a proceeding. To establish a nexus to a proceeding, it would be necessary to show that the President could reasonably foresee and actually contemplated that the investigation of Flynn was likely to lead to a grand jury investigation or prosecution. At the time of the President's one-on-one meeting with Comey, no grand jury subpoenas had been issued as part of the FBI's investigation into Flynn. But Flynn's lies to the FBI violated federal criminal law, redacted, and resulted in Flynn's prosecution for violating 18 U.S.C. Section 1001. By the time the President spoke to Comey about Flynn, DOJ officials had informed McCann, who informed the President, that Flynn's statements to senior White House officials about his contacts with Kislyak were not true, and that Flynn had told the same version of events to the FBI. McGann also informed the President that Flynn's conduct could violate 18 U.S.C. Section 1001. After the Vice President and senior White House officials reviewed the underlying information about Flynn's calls on February 10, 2017, they believed that Flynn could not have forgotten his conversations with Kislyak and concluded that he had been lying. In addition, the President's instruction to the FBI director to, quote, "let Flynn go," suggests his awareness that Flynn could face criminal exposure for his conduct and was at risk of prosecution.
Obstruction.
Steve, intent. As part of our investigation, we examined whether the President has a personal stake in the outcome of the investigation into Flynn. For example, whether the President was aware of Flynn's communication with Kislyak close in time to when they occurred, such that the President knew that Flynn had lied to senior White House officials and that those lies had been passed on to the public. Some evidence suggests that the President knew about the existence and content of Flynn's calls when they occurred, but the evidence is inconclusive and could not be relied upon to establish the President's knowledge. In advance of Flynn's initial call to Kislyak, the President attended a meeting where the sanctions were discussed, and an advisor may have mentioned that Flynn was scheduled to talk to Kislyak. Flynn told McFarland about the substance of his calls with Kislyak and said that they may have made a difference in Russia's response, and Flynn recalled talking to Bannon in early 2017 about how they successfully stopped the train on Russia's response to the sanctions. It would have been reasonable for Flynn to have wanted the President to know of his communications with Kislyak because Kislyak told Flynn his request had been received at the highest levels in Russia and that Russia had chosen not to retaliate in response to the request. And the President was pleased by that Russian response, calling it a great move. And the President never said publicly or internally that Flynn had lied to him about the calls with Kislyak. But McFarland did not recall providing the President-elect with Flynn's readout of his calls with Kislyak, and Flynn does not have a specific recollection of telling the President-elect about his calls. No, he doesn't remember. That's weird. Bannon also said he did not recall hearing about the calls from Flynn. And in February 2017, the President asked Flynn what was discussed on the calls and whether he had lied to the Vice President, suggesting that he did not already know. Our investigation accordingly did not produce evidence that established that the President knew about Flynn's discussion of sanctions before the Department of Justice notified the White House of those discussions in late January 2017. The evidence also does not establish that Flynn otherwise possessed information damaging to the President that would give the President a personal incentive to end the FBI's inquiry into Flynn's conduct. Evidence does establish that the President connected the Flynn investigation to the FBI's broader Russia thing, and that he believed, as he told Christie, that terminating Flynn would end the whole Russia thing. Flynn's firing occurred at the time when the media and the Congress were raising questions about Russia's interference in the election and whether members of the President's campaign had colluded with Russia. Multiple witnesses recalled that the president viewed the Russia investigations as a challenge to the legitimacy of his election. The president paid careful attention to negative coverage of Flynn and reacted with annoyance and anger when the story broke, disclosing that Flynn had discussed sanctions with Kislyak. Just hours before meeting one-on-one with Comey, the president told Christie, this was all on Valentine's Day, you guys, so romantic, that firing Flynn would put an end to the Russia inquiries. And after Christie pushed back, including laughing in his face, and told the president that firing Flynn would not end the Russia investigation, the president asked Christie to reach out to Comey and convey that the president liked him and was part of the team. That afternoon, the president cleared the room and wanted some special time with Comey to tell him to let Flynn go.
That meeting started with Trump asking a note that says, do you like me? Check yes or no. We also saw evidence relevant to assessing whether the president's direction to Comey was motivated by sympathy towards Flynn. In public statements, the president repeatedly described Flynn as a good person who had been harmed by the Russia investigation. And the president directed advisors to reach out to Flynn to tell him the president, quote, cared about him and felt bad for him. Which we all know is a joke because he doesn't care about anything. Yeah. At the same time, multiple senior advisors, including Bannon, Priebus, and Hicks, said that the president had become unhappy with Flynn well before Flynn was forced to resign, and that the president was frequently irritated with Flynn. Priebus had said he believed the president's initial reluctance to fire Flynn stemmed not from personal regard, but from concern about the negative press that would be generated by firing the national security advisor so early in the administration. And Priebus indicated that the president's post-firing expressions of support for Flynn were motivated by the president's desire to keep Flynn from saying negative things about him. That's a large house of cards to unpack. The way in which the president communicated the request to Comey also is relevant to understanding the president's intent. When the president first learned about the FBI investigation into Flynn, he told McGahn, Bannon, and Priebus, not to discuss the matter with anyone else in the White House. The next day, the president invited Comey for a one-on-one dinner on Valentine's Day against the advice of an aide who recommended that other White House officials also attend. At the dinner, the president asked Comey for, quote, loyalty, and at a different point in the conversation mentioned that Flynn had judgment issues, like generals do. When the president met with Comey the day after Flynn's termination, shortly after being told by Christie that firing Flynn would not end the Russia investigation, the president cleared the room, even excluding the Attorney General, so that he could again speak to Comey alone. The president's decision to meet one-on-one with Comey contravened the advice of the White House counsel, and the president should not communicate directly with the Department of Justice to avoid any appearance of interfering in law enforcement activities. And the president later denied that he cleared the room and asked Comey to, quote, let Flynn go, a denial that would have been unnecessary if he believed his request was a proper exercise of prosecutorial discretion. Finally, the president's effort to have McFarland write an internal email denying that the president had directed Flynn to discuss sanctions with Kislyak highlights the president's concern about being associated with Flynn's conduct. The evidence does not establish that the president was trying to have McFarland lie. But the president's request, however, was sufficiently irregular that McFarland, who did not know the full extent of Flynn's communication with the president and thus could not make the representation the president wanted, felt the need to draft an internal memorandum documenting the president's request, and Eisenberg was concerned that the request would look like a quid pro quo in exchange for an ambassadorship.
C. The president's reaction to public confirmation of the FBI's Russia investigation. Overview. In early March 2017, the president learned that Sessions was considering recusing from the Russia investigation and tried to prevent the recusal. After Sessions announced his recusal on March 2nd, the president expressed anger at Sessions for the decision and then privately asked Sessions to, quote, unrecuse. On March 20th, 2017, Comey publicly disclosed the existence of the FBI's Russia investigation. In the days that followed, the president contacted Comey and the other intelligence agency leaders and asked them to push back publicly on the suggestion that the president had any connection to the Russian election interference effort in order to, quote, lift the cloud of the ongoing investigation.
Evidence. 1. Attorney General Sessions recuses from the Russia investigation. Here's how it happened. In late February 2017, the Department of Justice began an internal analysis of whether Sessions should recuse from the Russia investigation based on his role in the 2016 Trump campaign. On March 1st, 2017, the press reported that in his January confirmation hearing to become Attorney General, Senator Sessions had not disclosed 2 meetings he had with Russian Ambassador Kislyak before the presidential election. And remember, this was Al Franken, my former boss, who solicited this information in a question to Sessions that led to his recusal. In the days that followed, the president contacted Comey and other intelligence agency leaders and asked them to push back publicly on the suggestion that the president had any connection to the Russian election interference effort in order to lift the cloud of the ongoing investigation.
Like, it feels good, we're honest.
This has never been done by a reader before, and it's my favorite thing that's ever happened. We're shedding skin in a way that is beautiful, and I hope I get to one day.
It feels fucking great. The next morning, the president called McGahn and urged him to contact Sessions to tell him not to recuse himself from the Russia investigation. McGahn understood the president to be concerned that a recusal would make Sessions look guilty for admitting details in his confirmation hearing, leave the president unprotected from an investigation that could hollow the presidency and derail his policy objectives and detract from favorable press coverage of a presidential address to Congress the president had delivered earlier in the week. McGahn reached out to Sessions and reported that the president was not happy about the possibility of a recusal. Sessions replied that he intended to follow the rules on recusal. McGahn reported back to the president about the call with Sessions, and the president reiterated that he did not want Sessions to recuse. Throughout the day, McGahn continued trying on behalf of the president to avert Sessions' recusal by speaking to Sessions' personal counsel, Sessions' chief of staff, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and by contacting Sessions himself 2 more times. That's not fucking desperate. Sessions recalled that other White House advisors also called him during that day to argue against his recusal.
That afternoon, Sessions announced his decision to recuse, quote, from any existing or future investigations of any matters related in any way to the campaigns for President of the United States, end quote. Sessions believed the decision to recuse was not a close call, given the applicable language in the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, which Sessions considered to be clear and decisive. Sessions thought that any argument that the CFR did not apply to him was, quote, very thin. Sessions got the impression, based on calls he received from White House officials, that the president was very upset with him and did not think he had done his duty as Attorney General. Shortly after Sessions announced his recusal, the White House counsel's office directed that Sessions should not be contacted about the matter. Internal White House counsel's office notes from March 2nd, 2017 state, quote, no contact with Sessions, and, quote, no communications, serious concerns about obstruction.
The next day, the day after Sessions' recusal, McGahn was called into the Oval Office. Other advisors were there, including Priebus and Bannon. The president opened the conversation by saying, I don't have a lawyer. The president expressed anger at McGahn about the recusal and brought up Roy Cohn, saying that he wished Cohn was his attorney. McGahn interpreted this comment as directed at him, suggesting that Cohn would fight for the president, whereas McGahn would not. The president wanted McGahn to talk to Sessions about the recusal, but McGahn told the president that DOJ ethics officials had weighed in on Sessions' decision to recuse. The president then brought up former Attorneys General Robert Kennedy and Eric Holder and said that they had protected their president. The president also pushed back on the DOJ contacts policy and said words to the effect of, you're telling me Bobby and Jack didn't talk about investigations? Or Obama didn't tell Eric Holder who to investigate? Bannon recalled that the president was as mad as Bannon had ever seen him, and he screamed at McGahn about how weak Sessions was. really wish I could have seen this part. Like imagine his face just turning red. Bannon recalled telling the president that Sessions' recusal was not a surprise, and that before the investigation and the inauguration, they had discussed that Sessions would have to recuse from campaign-related investigations because they knew of his work on the Trump campaign. That weekend, Sessions and McGahn flew to Mar-a-Lago to meet with the president. Sessions recalled that the president pulled him aside to speak to him alone and suggested that Sessions should unrecuse from the Russia investigation. The president contrasted Sessions with the attorneys General Holder and Kennedy, who had developed a strategy to help their presidents where Sessions had not. Sessions said he got the impression that the president feared that the investigation would spin out of control and disrupt his ability to govern, which Sessions could have helped avert if he were still overseeing it. On March 5, 2017, the White House counsel's office was informed that the FBI was asking for a transition period records relating to Flynn, indicating that the FBI was still actively investigating him. On March 6, the president told advisors he wanted to call the acting attorney general to find out whether the White House or the president was being investigated, although it is not clear whether the president knew at this time of the FBI's recent requests concerning Flynn.
Part 2. FBI Director Comey publicly confirms the existence of the Russia investigation in testimony before the House Committee on Intelligence. On March 9, 2017, Comey briefed the Gang of 8 congressional leaders about the FBI's investigation of Russian interference, including an identification of the principal U.S. subjects of the investigation. Although it is unclear whether the president knew of that briefing at the time, notes taken by Annie Donaldson, then McGahn's chief of staff on March 12, 2017, state, quote, POTUS in panic / chaos, ... need binders to put in front of POTUS. 1, all things related to Russia, end quote.
Pictures, prepare.
Yeah, I'm just giving pictures. Russia, POTUS, go! The week after Comey's briefing, the White House counsel's office was in contact with SSCI, I don't know what that means, Chairman Senator Richard Burr, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Chairman Senator Richard Burr, about the Russia investigation and appears to have received information about the status of the FBI investigation. On March 20th, 2017, Comey was scheduled to testify before the House Panel Select Committee on Intelligence. In advance of Comey's testimony, congressional officials made clear that they wanted Comey to provide information about the ongoing FBI investigation. Dana Valente, who at the time was the acting attorney general, because Sally Yates had resigned because she was a moral human being, he, as the acting attorney general for the Russia investigation, authorized Comey to confirm the existence of the Russia investigation and agreed that Comey should decline to comment on whether any particular individuals, including the president, were being investigated.
Sorry, I hit my PDF and I jumped. Where am I? Which page?
Page 53.
53.
Top of
Okay,
53.
Cool. In his opening remarks at the House Intelligence Committee hearing, which were drafted in consultation with the Department of Justice, Comey stated that he had, quote, been authorized by the DOJ to confirm that the FBI, as part of its counterintelligence mission, is investigating the Russian government's efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election, and that includes investigating the nature of any links between individuals associated with the Trump campaign and the Russian government, and whether there was any coordination between the campaign and Russia's efforts. As with any counterintelligence investigation, this will also include an assessment of whether any crimes were committed. Comey added that he would not comment further on what the FBI was doing and whose conduct it was examining, because the investigation was ongoing and classified. But he observed that he had, quote, taken the extraordinary step in consultation with the DOJ of briefing this Congress's leaders in a classified setting in detail about the investigation, end quote. Comey was specifically asked whether President Trump was, quote, under investigation during the campaign or under investigation now. Comey declined to answer, stating, please don't overinterpret what I've said as the chair and ranking know, we have briefed him in great detail on the subjects of the investigation and what we're doing, but I'm not going to answer about anybody in this forum. Comey was also asked whether the FBI was investigating the information contained in the Steele reporting, and he declined to answer. According to McGahn and Donaldson, the president had expressed frustration with Comey before his March 20th testimony, and the testimony made matters worse. The president had previously criticized Comey for too frequently making headlines and for not attending intelligence briefings at the White House, and the president suspected Comey of leaking certain information to the media. McGahn said the president thought Comey was acting, quote, like his own branch of government.
Press reports following Comey's March 20th testimony suggested that the FBI was investigating the president, contrary to what Comey had told the president at the end of the January 6, 2017 intelligence assessment briefing. McGahn, Donaldson, and senior advisor Stephen fucking Mueller recalled that the president was upset with Comey's testimony and the press coverage that followed because of the suggestion that the president was under investigation. Notes from the White House counsel's office dated March 21, 2017 indicate that the president was, quote, beside himself over Comey's testimony. The president called McGahn repeatedly that day to ask him to intervene with the Department of Justice, and according to the notes, the president was getting hotter and hotter. Get rid. Officials in the White House counsel was getting hotter and hotter. Get rid. Anyway, officials in the White House counsel's office became so concerned that the president would fire Comey that they began drafting a memorandum that examined whether the president needed cause to terminate the FBI director. We're on a high and titty now. At the president's urging, McGahn contacted Bente several times on March 21, 2017 to seek Bente's assistance in having Comey or the Department of Justice correct the misperception that the president was under investigation. Bente did not specifically recall the conversations, although he did remember one conversation with McGahn around this time where McGahn asked if there was a way to speed up or end the Russia investigation as quickly as possible. Bente said McGahn told him the president was under a cloud and it made it hard for him to govern. Bente recalled telling McGahn that there was no good way to shorten the investigation and that attempting to do so would erode confidence in the investigation's conclusions. Bente said McGahn agreed and dropped the issue. The president also sought to speak with Bente directly. Wow. The president also sought to speak with Bente directly, but McGahn told the president that Bente did not want to talk to the president about the request to intervene with Comey. McGahn recalled Bente telling him in calls that day that he did not think it was sustainable for Comey to stay on as FBI director for the next 4 years, which McGahn said he conveyed to the president. Bente did not recall discussing with McGahn or anyone else the idea that Comey should not continue as FBI director.
3. The president asks intelligence community leaders to make public statements that he had no connection to Russia. In the weeks following Comey's March 20, 2017 testimony, the president repeatedly asked intelligence community officials to push back publicly on the suggestion the president had a connection to the Russian election interference effort. On March 22, 2017, the president asked Director of National Intelligence Daniel Coates and CIA Director Mike Pompeo to stay behind in the Oval Office after a presidential daily briefing. According to Coates, the president asked them whether they could say publicly that no link existed between him and Russia. Coates responded that the office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI, has nothing to do with investigations, and it wasn't his role to make a public statement on the Russia investigation. Pompeo had no recollection of being asked to stay behind after the March 22nd briefing, but he recalled that the president regularly urged officials to get the word out that he had not done anything wrong related to Russia.
Coates told this office that the president never asked him to speak to Comey about the FBI investigation. Some ODNI, which we will call ODNI, staffers, however, had a different recollection of how Coates described the meeting immediately after it occurred. According to senior ODNI official Michael Dempsey, Coates said after the meeting that the president had brought up the Russia investigation and asked him to contact Comey to see if there was a way to get past the investigation, get it over with, end it, or words to that effect. Dempsey said that Coates described the president's comments as falling, quote, somewhere between musing about hating the investigation, end quote, and wanting Coates to, quote, do something to stop it. Dempsey said Coates made it clear that he would not get involved with an ongoing FBI investigation. Edward Gistaro, another ODNI official, recalled that right after Coates' meeting with the president, on the walk from the Oval Office back to the Eisenhower Executive Office building, Coates said that the president had kept him behind to ask him what he could do to, quote, help with the investigation. Another ODNI staffer who had been waiting for Coates outside the Oval Office talked to Gistaro a few minutes later and recalled Gistaro reporting that Coates was upset because the president had asked him to contact Comey to convince him there was nothing to the Russia investigation.
On Saturday, March 25th, 2017, 3 days after the meeting in the Oval Office, the president called Coates and again complained about the Russia investigations, saying words to the effect of, I can't do anything with Russia. There's some things I'd like to do with Russia, with trade, with ISIS. They're all over me with this. Coates told the president the investigations were going to go on, and the best thing to do was to let them run their course. Coates later testified in a congressional hearing that he had, quote, never felt pressure to intervene or interfere in any way, and shape, with shaping intelligence in a political way or in relationship to an ongoing investigation. On March 26, 2017, the day after the president called Coates, the president called NSA Director Admiral Michael Rogers. The president expressed frustration with the Russia investigation, saying it made relations with the Russians difficult. The president told Rogers, quote, the thing with the Russians messing up, quote, unquote, his ability to get things done with Russia. The president also said that the news stories linking him with Russia were not true, and asked Rogers if he could do anything to refute the stories. Deputy Director of the NSA, Richard Leggett, who was present for the call, said it was the most unusual thing he had experienced in 40 years of government service. After the call concluded, Leggett prepared a memorandum that he and Rogers both signed, documenting how fucked up that conversation was. And they placed it in a safe. But Rogers did not perceive the president's request to be in order, and the president did not ask Rogers to push back on the Russia investigation itself. Rogers later testified in a congressional hearing that as NSA director, he had, quote, never been directed to do anything he believed to be illegal, immoral, unethical, or inappropriate, and did not recall ever feeling pressured to do so.
In addition to the specific comments made to Coates, Pompeo, and Rogers, the president spoke on other occasions in the presence of intelligence community officials about the Russia investigation and stated that it interfered with his ability to conduct foreign relations. On at least 2 occasions, the president began presidential daily briefings by stating that there was no collusion with Russia, and he hoped a press statement to that effect could be issued. Anybody? Pompeo recalled that the president vented about the investigation on multiple occasions, complaining that there was no evidence against him and that nobody would publicly defend him. Rogers recalled a private conversation with the president in which he vented about the investigation and said he had done nothing wrong, and said something like the, quote, Russia thing has got to go away, end quote. Coates recalled the president bringing up the Russia investigation several times, and Coates said he finally told the president that Coates' job was to provide intelligence and not get involved in investigations. Part 4. The president asked Comey to, quote, lift the cloud, end quote, created by the Russia investigation. On the morning of March 30th, 2017, the president reached out to Comey directly about the Russia investigation. According to Comey's contemporaneous record of the conversation, the president said, quote, he was trying to run the country, and the cloud of this Russian business was making that difficult, end quote. The president asked Comey what could be done to, quote, lift the cloud, end quote. Comey explained, quote, that we were running it down as quickly as possible and that there would be great benefit if we didn't find anything. To our good housekeeping seal of approval, but we had to do our work, end quote. That sounds exactly like Comey. Comey also told the president that congressional leaders were aware that the FBI was not investigating the president personally. The president said several times, quote, we need to get that fact out, end quote. The president commented that if there was, quote, some satellite, end quote, which Comey took to mean an associate of the president's or the campaign that did something, quote, it would be a good to find that out, end quote. but that he himself had not done anything wrong, and he hoped Comey, quote, would find a way to get out of that we weren't investigating him, end quote. After the call ended, Comey called Fuente and told him about the conversation, asked for guidance on how to respond, and said he was uncomfortable with the direct contact with the president about the investigation. On the morning of April 11, 2017, the president called Comey again. According to Comey's contemporaneous record of the conversation, the president said, quote, following up to see if you did what I had asked last time, getting out that he personally did not, I'm not under investigation, end quote. Comey responded that he had passed the request to Fuente, but not heard back. And he informed the president that the traditional channel for such a request would be to, go fuck yourself, to have the White House counsel contact DOJ leadership. The president said he would take that step. The president then added, quote, because I have been very loyal to you, very loyal, we had that thing, end quote. In a televised interview that was taped early that afternoon, the president was asked if it was too late for him to ask Comey to step down. The president responded, quote, no, it's not too late, but I have confidence in him. We'll see what happens. It's going to be interesting, end quote. He was right about that. After the interview, Hicks told the president she thought the president's comment about Comey should be removed from the broadcast of the interview, but the president wanted to keep it, which Hicks thought was unusual.
Later that day, the president told senior advisors, including McGahn, and Priebus, keep doing it, that he had reached out to Comey twice in recent weeks. The president acknowledged that McGahn would not approve of the outreach to Comey because McGahn had previously cautioned the president that he should not talk to Comey directly to prevent any perception that the White House was interfering with investigations. Where would they get that idea? The president told McGahn that Comey had indicated the FBI could make a public statement that the president was not under investigation if the Department of Justice approved that action. After speaking with the president, McGahn followed up with Fuente to relay the president's understanding that the FBI could make a public announcement if the DOJ cleared it. McGahn recalled that how do we say his name, by the way? Bente? Okay. Okay. So that he responded that he did not want to issue a statement about the president not being under investigation because of the potential political ramifications, and did not want to order Comey to do it because that action could prompt the appointment of a special counsel. Bente did not recall that aspect of his conversation with McGahn, but did recall telling McGahn that the direct outreaches from the president to Comey were a problem. Bente recalled that McGahn agreed and said he would do what he could to address that issue.
Spoiler alert, a special counsel was appointed.
Sarah, how about a hand for Sarah? In analyzing the president's reaction to Sessions' recusal and the requests he made to Coates, Pompeo, Rogers, and Comey, the following evidence is relevant to the elements of obstruction of justice. A, an obstructive act. The evidence shows that after Comey's March 20th, 2017 testimony, the president repeatedly reached out to intelligence agency leaders to discuss the FBI's investigation. But witnesses had different recollections of the precise content of those outreaches. Some ODNI officials recalled that Coates told them immediately after the March 22nd Oval Office meeting that the president asked Coates to intervene with Comey and stop the investigation. But the first-hand witnesses to that encounter remember the conversation differently. Pompeo, liar, had no memory of the specific meeting, very convenient, but generally recalled the president urging officials to get the word out that the president had not done anything wrong related to Russia. Coates recalled that the president asked that Coates state publicly that no link existed between the president and Russia, but he did not ask him to speak with Comey or to help end the investigation. The other outreaches by the president during this period were similar in nature. The president asked Rogers if he could do anything to refute the stories linking the president to Russia, and the president asked Comey to make a public statement that would lift the cloud. See, he knows who's corrupt and who isn't, and what to ask him. These requests, while significant enough that Rogers thought it was important to document the encounter in a written memorandum, were not interpreted by the officials who received them as directives. from improperly interfering with the investigation. Put that in there.
B, nexus to a proceeding. At the time of the President's outreaches to leaders of intelligence agencies in late March and early April 2017, the FBI's Russia investigation did not yet involve grand jury proceedings. The outreaches, however, came after and were in response to Comey's March 20, 2017 announcement that the FBI, as part of its counterintelligence mission, was conducting an investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Comey testified that the investigation included any links or coordination with Trump campaign officials and would include an assessment of whether any crimes were committed. Intent. As described above, the evidence does not establish that the President asked or directed intelligence leaders to stop or interfere with the FBI's Russia investigation. The President affirmatively told Comey that if some satellite was involved in Russian election interference, it would be good to find that out.
Probably.
The President's intent in trying to prevent Sessions' recusal and reaching out to Coates, Pompeo, Rogers, and Comey following Comey's public announcement of the FBI's Russia investigation is nevertheless relevant to understanding what motivated the President's other actions towards the investigation.
Again, I have these Pokemon cards.
Stay on topic.
The evidence shows that the President was focused on the Russia investigation's implications for his presidency, and specifically on dispelling any suggestion that he was under investigation or had links to Russia. In early March, the President attempted to prevent Sessions' recusal, even after being told that Sessions was following DOJ conflict of interest rules. After Sessions recused, the White House counsel's office tried to cut off further contact with Sessions about the matter, although it is not clear whether that direction was conveyed to the President. The President continued to raise the issue of Sessions' recusal, and when he had the opportunity, he pulled Sessions aside and urged him to unrecuse. The President also told advisors that he wanted an Attorney General who would protect him, the way he perceived Robert Kennedy and Eric Holder to have protected their presidents. The President made statements about being able to direct the course of criminal investigations, saying words to the effect of, quote, "You're telling me that Bobby and Jack didn't talk about investigations, or Obama didn't tell Eric Holder who to investigate?" End quote. After Comey publicly confirmed the existence of the FBI's Russia investigation on March 20th, 2017, the President was, quote, beside himself, and expressed anger that Comey did not issue a statement correcting any misperception that the President himself was under investigation. The President sought to speak with the acting Attorney General, I'm just going to call him Benny, directly, and told McGahn to contact Benny to request that Comey make a clarifying statement. The President then asked other intelligence community leaders to make public statements to refute the suggestion that the President had links to Russia, but the leaders told him they could not publicly comment on the investigation. On March 30th and April 11th, against the advice of White House advisors, who had informed him that any direct contact with the FBI could be perceived as improper interference in an ongoing investigation, the President made personal outreaches to Comey, asking him to, quote, lift the cloud of the Russia investigation by making public the fact that the President was not personally under investigation.
Let's hear it for the cloud. Okay, just to wrap it up here, the evidence indicates that the President was angered by both the existence of the Russia investigation and the public reporting that he was under that investigation, which he knew was not true based on Comey's representations. The President complained to advisors that people thought Russia helped him with the election would detract from what he had accomplished. Yeah, asterisk forever, motherfucker. Other evidence indicates that the president was concerned about the impact of the Russian investigation on his ability to govern. The president had complained that the perception that he was under investigation was hurting his ability to conduct foreign relations, particularly with Russia. The president told Coates he can't do anything with Russia. He told Rogers that the thing with the Russians was interfering with his ability to conduct foreign affairs, and he told Comey he was just trying to run the country, and the cloud of this Russian business was making him difficult.
Put your hands together, that's the end of 9-4, everybody! Woo! We did it! That's the first part of Volume 2. I want everyone to keep those claps going for Sarah Clough, Avery Brown, Lauren Howe, Chad Nichols, Jenny Marie Jennison, and Jason Romero. That also includes Sarah Holgraffer working her ass off up in the booth. We got all of the North Shore staff. If you haven't tipped them amazingly, you still have time to do so. My name is David Higgins. Thank you so much for being here. We will be back here 1 week from tonight to continue reading from this heinous list of things our president has done. We hope you will join us. And until then, please go register to vote. Find a friend who isn't registered and register them to vote. Until then, we will see you next Sunday. Good night and good impeachment.